Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Never Got One for All? A special shout out to the original creator, Kairon Desurmyo. This is the permission statement by the author in written. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. She shivered as she entered the cold building, checking again behind her to ensure she wasn't being followed. In front of her stood Lemillion, a strong hero who practically raised her. He'd saved her from the Yakuza, from Overhaul. He was like a brother, and even after all those years, he continued taking care of her. It's gonna be okay, Eri. Because of you, we may have figured out a way to fix everything. He was always quick to make a bad situation into a good one. His positive outlook gave her hope. Even through the worst of the war, he'd always cheer her up. Yeah, she sighed. He was unlocking the door in front of them, and so she stood and observed their surroundings. She'd never been in that part of Ua. The deep basements were all that remained anymore, and they were forbidden as to remain a secret. Before the majority of the building perished, she'd been inside to watch Mirio and all of the festivities they'd hold there. If things were normal, she probably would be in her first year. The door finally opened. Mirio held it open and gestured for her to walk inside. She glanced at him warily before entering. It wasn't any warmer in there, but heating systems were a rarity in those times. Still, she hoped that Shoto would be there. He could probably use his quirk to heat the place up. Eri, Mirio. Come on in. It was Ingenium, a pro hero that took a leadership role quickly after many of the former pros had passed. We were just getting started with this meeting. Eri nodded and looked at the others in the room. There weren't many, but enough for the plan to be efficient. They all sat on the floor, a fire burning over a pile of wood in the middle. The table was left abandoned, but Eri didn't mind. Being warm sounded more appealing than being comfortable. There were even some pillows provided by Creati. She sat down next to Mirio. Next to her was Uravity, or Achiko Ururika. She specialized in rescue, able to get debris off of civilians and help them to safety. Still, she often had to fight in the major battles due to the hero shortages. Hey, Eri. She smiled. Eri smiled back. Alright, I think this is everyone that was able to make it here today. I'll inform the others on it soon enough, but we don't have time to wait. Ingenium sat down by them. Momo, would you care to begin? Yes, of course. Creati cleared her voice. Katsuki's condition is worsening. He's showing no signs of waking up, and with our limited resources, well, I'm afraid there's not much we can do to help him. Katsuki Bakugu, he was a strong hero. After the death of the former high-ranking heroes, he quickly stepped up and fought in many villain attacks. The ranking system no longer existed, but Eri wanted to say that he was in the top 3. His skills were on par with Lemillion and Shoto. Bakugu had been in a coma ever since his battle with Deku. Deku was the strongest villain in the league. He ended up inheriting a quirk known as All for One. He was unstoppable, but he also sustained severe injuries in the battle. It had been quiet ever since. What are you saying? He's not dead yet, we can't give up on him. Red Riot, or Eijiro Kirishima. He was the closest to Bakugu out of everyone. There's gotta be something you can create dash. Let her finish. Ingenium spoke. He always liked staying on task, especially during meetings. It was something she'd noticed a lot, especially after the loss of most of the old pros. Thank you, Ida. She sighed, gazing around at everyone. Eri knew what was coming. She felt her heart race. Eri has been training with her quirk. We've tried figuring out if she is able to undo the damage on him. We've been able to heal the injuries that way, but he remains unconscious. So, we've discovered that she's able to send our consciousness back in time. What? Denki scratched his head. I don't think I'm following. You're saying she can send us back in time, but we keep our memories? Denki Kaminari was a smart guy, though his quirk caused some brain damage over the years. Even so, he was able to pick up on small details. Essentially, the details are a bit complicated, and there's not much time to explain. She looked over at Eri, and then at Ingenium. Ida, you're better at explaining this part than I am. He nodded. We have devised a plan, one that could prevent this war from ever happening. The room filled with silence as each hero processed what they just heard. Ingenium was giving them time to think. He stared at them. Thanks to Bakugo, we were able to find out personal information about Deku, to be more specific, where he grew up. If we can go back in time and put an end to his villainy, then we can prevent this entire war. What exactly do you mean by put an end to his villainy? Uravity asked. She looked concerned, as if she knew what the implications meant. Whatever it takes, even if it means taking his life, he sighed. It's unfortunate, but necessary. We don't have time to sit around and wait either. We will send most of you back. I trust each of you to succeed. Eri bit the inside of her cheek. The task would be draining. Then there was the waiting. She wasn't even sure how immediate the results of their actions would be. The room held several heroes, all strong and capable of such a simple task. It would fix everything, right? So, let's begin. Those sent back will be Todoroki, Kirishima, Kaminari, Uraraka, Ashido, Shinso, and Yaoyorozu. He sighed and adjusted his glasses. I'll stay behind to make sure things go smoothly here. I wish all of you the best of luck. We'll begin the process in 30 minutes. Eri looked at Mirio and rubbed her eyes. It was all up to her. She was their only hope. You're gonna do great, and I'll be here the whole time to help you. He looked over at Ingenium, who was walking over to them. Hey Ida. Hello Mirio, Eri. You're both sure that this'll work? He asked. He rubbed the back of his head. He wasn't even entirely sure of the plan, yet he put so much trust in it. It was strange. Mirio nodded. Eri and I practiced it a bunch. She was able to send me back to when I was a UA student. Unfortunately, because of the fact that she was newer at it, I was sent back to this time very quickly. But we've strengthened it a bunch since then. That's good. I hope it works out. Momo is filling them all in on the specifics. They'll all be in the bodies of their younger selves, so that means they'll all have to find each other. That's what I'm most worried about, but I trust that Momo will be able to gather them together. Eri nodded, staring off at the others. This was her chance to shine, to show she was a hero too. Even without the training that they all received. // His full name is Izuku Midoriya. He went to Aldra Junior High. Momo looked over at Kirishima and sighed. I know Ida said that we may have to kill him, but let's not resort to that as our first plan. Remember, we're in the past and the heroes have no idea of what Deku will become. They'll see it as manslaughter. We'll only get severe punishment for that kind of action. Shoto stared at the ground. He'd had the same concerns. If they really were going to the past, then they needed to be careful to not cause suspicion. He'd have to deal with his father once more. He'd have to sneak out of the house to go help look for the future villain. Questions. Do you know if we'll all be at the same place or will we be at our own homes when we travel back? He decided to confirm his theory. He needed to have a plan. To make a plan though, he needed to know what he was dealing with. I believe we'll be where we were at the exact moment we travel back to. So we'll all have to make our way there, but as long as you all remember the address, it should be fine. He nodded. It made sense, but sneaking out would be rather difficult. He'd have to hope that luck was on his side. It would all be worth it in the end, he knew that. Bakugo wouldn't make it much longer. They all knew he was on his deathbed. Not to mention Deku, him being as silent as he was. It was concerning because they all knew he was still alive. His injuries may have been severe, but the guy had so many quirks that it was impossible to kill him because of many healing ones. They had to stop him and fast. This was the only way. Eri's ready when you all are, Lemillion spoke as he walked over to them. Shoto stared at the young teenager that followed behind the pro-hero and sighed. He'd been that age when everything started to go downhill, the year that Deku revealed himself to the public. The world had changed a lot, so going back to how it used to be, it sounded nice. We're ready, he said, noticing that the others nodded along. They didn't have the time to waste, they needed to get out there. They all gathered around Eri, each placing a hand on her arm that she held out. The horn on her head began to glow as she concentrated, her eyes shut tightly. Shoto began to feel his body tingle. His head began to pound as he felt this mind splitting from his body. The room began to spin. He shut his eyes tightly and hoped that something would happen, and soon. That was when the pain stopped. He felt himself drift off into a void of nothing. He didn't know how much time had passed when his eyes fluttered open, but all he knew was that it didn't matter. He sat up in his old childhood bed, the curtains slightly open and allowing a bright stream of light to enter his room. He was noticeably shorter, he felt the ease of his muscles and the lack of scars from battles that hadn't happened yet. He never realized how light his body felt when he was young. He'd assumed he was in the body of his 13-year-old self. His first obstacle was getting out of his house and meeting up with everyone else, which he knew would cause some conflict. His father was in a phase of obsession over Shoto, wanting to train his quirk and ensure him to be a worthy successor. Another obstacle was actually finding the others. He wasn't sure if they looked any similar to how they did during their first year at UA. Either way, he quickly got changed and packed a bag with enough belongings to last him a while, then opened the window. He stepped out of the window as quietly as possible, hoping that his siblings and father all remained asleep. He didn't really care about the repercussions of seemingly running away. He was more focused on the task at hand. His father wouldn't exactly understand nor believe him, so staying away from him was the best option. He pulled out the phone from his pocket and stared at the lock screen. What was his old passcode? His young self would definitely have made a complex password, but his 25-year-old self would just set it to 4 zeros and call it good. He closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. This would be a lot more difficult than he'd planned. She'd been walking for a while, following the directions given to her by her phone. Uraraka was determined. She knew she needed to find Deku and fast. She wasn't exactly sure of what she'd do when she did find him, but she hoped that the others would be with her when that would happen. She leaned back on the park bench she'd chosen to rest at. She'd made it to the correct town and was hoping to spot a familiar face. It'd be hard to recognize anyone though. She hadn't seen their younger appearances since her time at UA. I'd expected to see Momo before you dash. She looked up and smiled when she saw who approached her. Hitoshi Shinso was the last person she'd expected to arrive next, but she was glad to see him. He looked very similar to how he looked when she'd first met him, though he wore a hoodie and jeans instead of the UA uniform he wore at school. He'd never designed a hero costume, instead just choosing to fight in his regular clothes. He didn't really need any special outfit anyways. He only needed his binding cloth that was given to him by Aizawa-sensei during their first year. It seems we were the closest to this town. Uraraka nodded and smiled. I'm sure the others will be here soon. In the meantime, we should take a break and admire the safety of the hero world in this timeline. Shinso didn't seem so convinced, more focused on the task at hand. He was scouting the area, staring at the nearby kids playing in the park. She stared at him for another moment, before looking down at her hands, which rested gently on her lap. She had put on her old junior high uniform that morning, telling her parents that she was going early to study. Seeing her parents again was more emotional than she'd expected. I believe that's Kirishima and Ishido. Shinso pointed out the two people walking towards them. Kirishima looked extremely different. His hair wasn't spiked up nor red. It was pitch black and hung to his shoulders. Mina looked the same, bright pink skin and even brighter pink hair. The pair approached them, grinning giddily as Mina complained about how hard it was to find the small town. No sign of the others yet, I take it? Kirishima looked around to confirm his theory, and sighed when he didn't see any other familiar faces. We just gotta find the dude and figure out how to stop him. Shouldn't be too hard, eh? Before anyone else could even think of responding, a loud crash could be heard from deeper within the city. They found themselves rushing to the scene, their hero instincts kicking in. It didn't take long for the reality to sink in that they couldn't fight the villain. They may have the expertise of pro heroes, but their younger selves did not have the abilities to keep up. Their lack of hero licenses didn't help either. They stopped running once they reached a large crowd of spectators viewing the battle. Kamui Woods had taken to the challenge of fighting. Uraraka caught her breath, staring at the people in the crowd. She could feel the presence of someone she knew, so she hoped it was just one of her friends. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face Deku, or even a younger Bakugo for that matter. Oh, it's you guys, Shoto's voice spoke. He approached them with a kind smile. Behind him stood Momo and Denki, who just watched the fight with concentration. We were looking for you. Same goes for you, Shinso mumbled, not exactly interested in the reunion. They hadn't really been away from each other for long. We need to stay on task. If Deku is really in this town, we have to know what to look for. All we know is that he has very plain features. He doesn't stand out much besides the scars he has when he's older. Yeah, I doubt he has any of those scars yet. He does have dark green hair, and he has freckles on his cheeks too. Momo started looking around, searching for anyone that may match that appearance. Even so, those traits were so plain that he'd probably blend in with the crowd. Uraraka started to look around as well, her eyes gazing through each face and each hairstyle. They couldn't even be certain that he was there, and after a while, they agreed that he wasn't. We need to find somewhere to stay for now, we can't just keep leaving and coming back. Momo looked around. She didn't think any hotel would allow a group of 13 and 14-year-olds to rent out a room, so that was off the table. She also doubted that anyone there would allow that many kids into their home, so that was also a no-go. Wait a minute. I'm rich. With all the chaos that happened in the world, money wasn't much of anything. Sure, it was still used to buy food and all the essentials, but fancy houses wouldn't last long, and businesses couldn't run properly. The economy had fallen, and Momo had completely forgotten of her wealth status over the years. Okay, so how will that dash Mina began, though she was quickly interrupted by Momo. I can just buy out somewhere to stay. We can buy the entire hotel. She grinned, almost in the way a true madman would. Uraraka was close to just laughing and agreeing, but she knew that buying out a hotel wouldn't end well. Or, you can bribe the hotel to let us stay in a few rooms, Denki reasoned, then looked over at Kirishima. Whoa, your hair is dash. Shut it. Don't pretend like you never noticed when my roots were growing in black. Kirishima raised his voice, holding up a fist. He was always competitive, but he loved pretending to fight with those he considered friends. It was a habit he'd gotten from Bakugo. They all sighed and started heading away from the battle. Todoroki and Uraraka stood in the front, having a small conversation about what they'd be able to do in terms of housing. Uraraka wasn't sure she fully trusted Momo's idea. They hadn't even realized they'd walked right into someone. The person fell over and Todoroki nearly did as well. Kirishima and Kaminari both stopped their rambling and stared at the kid. Are you all right? Shoto asked, offering a hand to the boy he'd bumped into. The boy seemed skittish, almost too much. He started stammering and mumbling things that didn't sound like words. Eventually, he allowed Shoto to help him up, and that was when Uraraka noticed the green hair and freckled cheeks. She widened her eyes and tugged on the sleeves of Momo's blazer. She seemed to notice as well. He seemed to be holding a notebook. It was held closely to his chest. Uraraka noticed the hesitance in Shoto. He had just realized who he was talking to. I'm so sorry. Deku gave up on whatever he was trying to say and bit his lip to stop himself from speaking. His head was lowered and he could only see the shoes of the people in front of him. No reason to be sorry. Shoto looked back at the others and sighed. What's the notebook for? Deku clutched the notebook tighter and frowned. It's nothing important. Okay, Shoto mumbled. It was obvious that he was unsure of what to say next. So Uraraka decided to step in. Were you going to check out the villain fight? She tried to sound as energized as possible. She had to replicate how bubbly she used to be. It's cool, right? He nodded, his frown turned into a small smile. Yeah, I like to watch them and study the quirks of the heroes and villains. She seemed flustered again. Sorry, that's weird. I'm sorry. What for? She tilted her head and tried to smile. She was quite terrified of how normal he seemed. Well, how non-villainous he seemed anyways. She stared at his appearance, which was very different from the villain she once knew. His hair was messy, uncontrolled curls that extended out into every direction. His face was constantly worried, brows furrowed downwards and eyes wide. His eyes were a brighter green color than what she remembered. He was wearing a typical junior high uniform, and his shoes were a bright red. The one thing that she couldn't stop looking at were the bruises that were poking out of his uniform. Traces of a deep purple on his arms and jaw. She hadn't noticed until just then. What happened to your jaw? His eyes widened even more, his arm instinctively reaching up to the marks. He bit his lip deeper. Uraraka was worried that he'd break through the skin. The Deku from her timeline was very different. He actively tried to be in conflict and get into fights. He'd taunt them and laugh at everything. He'd tell long speeches on the hero society and how flawed it was. So how could he have gone from a timid kid to what they knew him to be? I've gotta go. He didn't leave a moment for them to interrogate him any longer. He turned around and started running off. Kirishima started trying to run after him, but Shinso grabbed his arm and shook his head. "Leave him be for now, we'll run into him again." Shinso looked determined about something, like he'd made a realization that none of them could make. Uraraka mentally noted to ask him about it later, but now wasn't the time. She sighed and leaned her head down on Momo's shoulder. "Maybe we should look for Bakugo," Momo suggested, taking in a deep breath. "He might know what is happening with Deku." Izuku didn't exactly know what to do, or even if he reacted properly. He was never good with people, and he'd accepted that for a long time, but these kids were curious. He was similar, always curious about the smallest details. He didn't like these kids though. He especially didn't like that they all wore different school uniforms. It wouldn't have been as concerning if they wore the same one, even if it didn't belong to Aldra, but they all came from different schools, except two of them anyway. The pink girl and the boy with spiky black hair and red eyes, their uniforms were from the same school. The thing that confused him the most though, was the fact that they seemed to recognize him. He'd never met any of them in his life. He sighed, continuing to walk down the alleyway that had always been a good way to avoid any unwanted attention. He was going to watch the fight. He'd heard Kamui Woods was in the area and wanted to add more notes to his hero analysis book. It seemed like he'd be better off going home. Maybe he could go online and see if All Might fought any new battles. "Deku." He tensed up, the familiar voice echoing in his ears. "Who are those kids?" "Keikachin." I don't really know," he began, though his mouth refused to cooperate. Izuku was never all that comfortable around Kachin, not since he got his quirk and decided that Izuku wasn't worth his time. Well, not unless he could do some target practice on him, and those burns and bruises would take forever to go away. It had become impossible to hide. His mother kept trying to intervene and he'd find ways out of it. He didn't like worrying her, so he often stayed away from home to try and lessen his time around her. Sometimes he thought of never returning, because him being gone would make her life so much easier. Bullshit, who were they? Izuku could already feel Kachin activate his quirk, small sparks emitting from his palm. Izuku closed his eyes. He knew better than to try and fight back. He had no quirk, no way of fighting back. He'd learned self-defense. It was a highly encouraged class that is offered to quirkless kids. Those lessons didn't teach him the courage to actually fight back. Izuku could feel the heat near him. He braced for impact. The impact never came. The burning heat turned into an icy cold breeze. He opened his eyes slowly. A wall of ice divided Izuku away from Kachin. She couldn't believe it, honestly. They'd been passing by, just thinking up a plan. That was when they heard Bakugo's voice, a much younger version anyways. It was an obvious choice to go find him. Maybe his younger self would understand. Maybe even help them figure out a way to prevent the horrid future that awaited them. As it turned out, they'd found out more information than they ever thought they would. They all knew that Bakugo had issues with his anger, and he was always quick to violence, but he'd never hurt anyone innocent. That's what they thought anyways. Apparently bullying a classmate was okay to him, and it may have also been why he never let anyone know of his connection to Deku until it was absolutely necessary. "Who the hell are you?" Bakugo asked. He let his arms fall to his sides as he stopped using his quirk. The wall of ice was resilient against the heat. It stood strong. Deku stared at them from behind the ice. His eyes were wide with shock. "My name is Shoto Todoroki," he frowned. "For someone aiming to be a pro-hero, you're not acting very heroic." Bakugo raised a brow. "And how would you know that I want to be a hero, huh? Did Deku tell you all about me?" Kirishima approached them, standing by Shoto. "We don't even know who Deku is, but I'm guessing he's the kid on the other side of this ice." Kirishima couldn't stand seeing Bakugo act so cruel. He couldn't believe that this was how he used to be. He'd changed a lot, but what exactly caused that change? Whatever the case, Kirishima wasn't finding it hard to pretend to not know who this Bakugo was. To him, this wasn't the same guy he knew for years. Bakugo rolled his eyes and gazed over at Shoto. "So, Todoroki? I'm guessing you're the brat of Endeavor." Shoto glared back at him, but he didn't say anything back. The Todoroki family had been through a lot, but their broken relationship had healed over time. That didn't mean that the pain was gone though, and the current time he was in, his relationship with his father was next to nothing. "Listen, I appreciate your concerns, but you should stay out of our business. Bakugu shoved his hands into his pocket. There's no reason to save someone like Deku. He walked away, not giving any of them any time to process his words. Shinso was the first to move. He pulled Deku out from behind the ice and sighed. Let me guess, you've got a quirk that he thinks is useless, so he bullies you for it? Shinso had asked. Those words made Uraraka realize why Shinso had originally taken the approach he did when they let Midoriya run away. Shinso was bullied as a kid for his quirk. He was told by society that he'd be a villain because that's what they expected his quirk to be used for. Deku frowned and looked away. That's not it. Don't worry about it. Deku, I know we just met you, but we're here to help. We care about you. Uraraka smiled at him, but that smile faltered when he flinched back. Can you not call me that? His voice was soft. He almost looked like he'd apologize for even daring to speak. It's just, I don't like being called that. Oh, what should I call you then? Uraraka was more than confused by that. The villain she knew had happily declared himself as Deku to the world. It was the name everyone knew him as. She even knew his real name too, but to him she only knew of Deku. Oh, Izuku Midoriya. Nice to meet you. He bowed down, which seemed overly formal to the group, but they didn't bother to say anything. They figured he was just overly polite. Ochako Uraraka. Shoto Todoroki, it's nice to meet you. Momo Yaoyorozu. Momo smiled and offered a hand. He hesitated before shaking it. Ijiro Kirishima. The name is Denki Kaminari. Mina Ishido. Oh, I'm Hitoshi Shinso. Izuku nodded. So what are you all here for? I noticed the different school uniforms and they hadn't actually made up a fake reason for being there, so they all were silent for a moment. Well, you see, Momo began, though she couldn't think up a good enough excuse. We were in the area, Shoto had started, though he even seemed troubled on how to finish his sentence. We're recommended for the hero course at UA. Our instructors wanted us to get some experience traveling around Japan and meeting all different kinds of heroes. They all glanced at Denki, who just smiled awkwardly. Oh, UA? That's so cool. I've always wanted to go there. It's the school where Izuku stopped his rambling and frowned. I'm sorry, I can't help it. That's really cool though. You should go there for sure. I bet you'll do great. Mina smiled at him, but they all noticed how upset he looked after she said that. You all right, Midoriya? He nodded. I should get going. My mom is going to worry if I'm not home soon. I'm sure you all have somewhere to be too. Actually, Momo stopped him. We don't have a place to stay right now. Do you think your mother would let us stay over for a day or two, just until we can find a place to stay? Midoriya looked over at the group and furrowed his brows. He was thinking. It's not a problem if you can't dash. No, it's not a problem at all. I'm trying to think of a place where we can set up for you to all sleep at. Shinso still couldn't get over the shock of having to rethink his opinions on Midoriya. On one hand, the guy became a highly dangerous villain who would go on to cause the deaths of many people Shinso was close to. On the other hand, this kid was being bullied by Bakugu for a reason he won't share, one that makes it seem like Bakugu isn't the only one. Shinso could have easily turned out the same way that Midoriya had. He sighed and followed behind the others into the small house. It was a regular-looking house, nothing all that special to it. Entering the interior was strange though. Midoriya's mother stood in the kitchen with her back faced towards them. Izuku, I'm making your favorite meal. I wanted to talk to you. She turned around and noticed the group of kids that followed behind her son. Oh, why didn't you call me to let me know I needed to make more? She was a nice woman, from what Shinso could tell. Her face was seemingly youthful, though it was clear that she was stressed. She was wearing a kitchen apron, her hair green like her son's. She didn't share the freckled face, nor did she share the frail and way too skinny body that her son had. He was starting to suspect a lack of eating from Izuku Midoriya, especially seeing how she was cooking his apparent favorite dish. Sorry, it was a last-minute thing. Izuku took his shoes off and set his backpack aside, looking back at the others and attempting to smile. Is it all right if they stay here for a day or two? They're from out of town and are traveling. They need a place to stay. Mrs. Midoriya gazed over at them and smiled. Of course. Any friend of Izuku is welcome to stay as long as they would like. Oh, I wouldn't exactly say that they're my dash. Thank you, Mrs. Midoriya. Could I help you with making that while the others get settled for the night? Momo offered. She was already walking towards the kitchen. She turned back and faced the others, giving them a look that made them realize that she was trying to gather more information. They had to do the same. So, Midoriya, where will we be staying? Kirishima asked, taking Momo's advice. Midoriya looked around the room and shrugged. We have one guest bedroom, but it can maybe fit 3 people at most. The rest of you will have to sleep in the living room. Girls will take the guest bedroom, if you don't mind, Mina smiled. Midoriya nodded and showed her and Uraraka where the room was. They set their things in the room and followed Izuku back into the main room. He pointed towards the set of couches. It would be enough. So, how about we see your room? Denki suggested, though the look on Midoriya's face put concern in the mind of Shinso. Oh, no, that's probably not a good idea. He raised his hands up defensively. It's not all that cool. Before he could say any more, Mina started heading down the hallway and stopped at the door with an All Might sign on the front. You like All Might? She grinned, putting her hand on the knob and turning it. Why, I guess. Oh no. The door opened, and they were all shown the room. All Might merch was everywhere. The blankets, posters, figurines. It was all the #1 hero. This is embarrassing, he mumbled, but still followed them all into the room. It's weird, I know. Not everything about you is weird, you know. Denki's eyes caught the sight of the bookcase. It was full of notebooks similar to the one Midoriya held earlier. He pulled one out and looked through it. You take notes on heroes? Midoriya was flustered, to say the least. Yeah, I do. Please don't say that it's nerdy. He covered his face with his hand. Sorry, everyone in my school thinks it's dumb and pointless. I just want to make notes for when I try and become a hero one day. Shinso raised a brow and exchanged a glance with Todoroki. A hero? He wanted to be a hero? Something bad had to have happened to change his mind, and maybe figuring out what that event was, well, it might just prevent what was to come in the future. Momo thought that Inko Midoriya was a very kind woman. She seemed to care about her son more than anything. So, does Izuku have any other friends? Inko frowned. I don't know, to be honest with you. She set down a whisk. He used to be close with the son of one of my friends. Katsuki Bakugu. They went everywhere together when they were younger. Now, he gets all gloomy when I ask him about Katsuki. Momo nodded. She'd seen the way Bakugu treated Izuku. Inko didn't seem to know that the bruises came from the boy. I can't help but worry about him. His father works overseas, so it's just us two. He used to never leave my side because of that, but now I'm lucky if he comes home. And then there's the bruises. I know the kids in his class are hurting him and I can't stand to see him like this. Why don't you involve the teachers? Or even the authorities? Inko wiped a tear from her cheek. It wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't help him. Why not? Momo knew that if she were told about a situation like that, she'd do whatever she could to stop it. She shook her head. You wouldn't understand. He wants to be a hero, you know? He looks up to All Might and wants to be exactly like him. Momo was starting to grow confused as to what Inko meant, but she didn't dare ask. She had a feeling there was something that neither of the Midoriyas wanted to admit. Does this have anything to do with Izuku's quirk, or? Inko stared at her. She ignored the food she'd been preparing. She breathed in. He doesn't have a quirk, that's the issue? She stared at the woman in front of her with shock, but that sentence was enough to make the whole situation clear. Izuku Midoriya was quirkless, he got bullied for it, and no one cared enough to stop it. So, Midoriya, what's your quirk? Kirishima asked. Usually I can tell after a while, but you haven't used it at all around us. Midoriya was sitting on his bed, his legs curled up to his chest as he conversed with the group. He frowned, running a hand through his messy hair and avoiding a response. He mumbled something that none of them could decipher. I don't. More mumbling. Speak up. Shoto spoke, and Shinso almost chuckled. They'd all been calling Izuku a kid, because to them they were all still adults. It must have been weird being called a kid by other kids. I don't have one. You don't have, Uraraka began, trying to figure out if what he just implied was really what he meant. I've been quirkless my entire life, okay? It seemed to be a tough subject, and Shinso was starting to think that it wasn't a good idea to bring it up. It's why everyone hates me. So now you can all hate me too, You can leave me like everyone else. Shinso bit the inside of his cheek. He'd sometimes wished he'd been born quirkless as a kid. He always thought no quirk was better than a villain quirk. He never considered how much worse a quirkless kid would have it. We don't hate you, and we aren't going to leave you. Shinso attempted to show him a kind smile, though he was never all that good at comforting people. Let us help you. This was why they went back to the past. It wasn't to kill him like Ida suggested. It was to prevent him from becoming a villain. It was to help him. They all hated the Deku of their future. They hated the villainy that he obsessed over. They had wanted to kill him, even if it wasn't something that they should do. But now, it seemed like they were talking to a completely different person. Izuka didn't say anything else, but they all noticed the gentle stream of tears crawling down his cheeks. You heroes don't do shit for anyone. You save one person and think you deserve to be worshipped. Deku stood atop a building, the last one standing in that town. Everything was reduced to rubble. A mere fraction of what the city once was. Kachin, don't think I've forgotten about how much of a hypocrite you are. Bakugo could barely stand. Kirishima felt useless. He couldn't even do anything to help, to fight. His own quirk was useless. There were too many Nomu to fight, too many quirks in each. Quirks that would overpower his own. So many had died trying to fight Deku, several were still listed as MIA because their bodies were never found. The villain in question was the only person left in Japan that had any ounce of strength, any energy. The villains themselves were worn out. Years of battle was enough to make anyone lose their sense of purpose. Deku prevailed, mainly because of his large supply of quirks. There had to be one for everything, but Kirishima didn't want to be the dumbass who asked. Katsuki, we have to leave. You can't win this, dude. He wiped the blood that trailed down his face. He couldn't take another hit or he'd collapse. His body shook violently as he gathered all the strength in him to even open his mouth. Bakugo wasn't looking any better. He'd lost the ability to see out of one of his eyes, an arm broken from being thrown into a building. Kirishima was certain there was more than just an arm that was broken, but he was no doctor. Deku, what the hell happened to turn you into this? You hated villains. Kirishima looked up at Deku, who was releasing a poisonous gas from his fingertips. It wouldn't take long to reach Bakugo, and one whiff of it could kill him. But that wasn't what his mind was processing. No, he was focused on hearing Bakugo act like Deku was someone he was close to once. That was what freaked him out the most. But those words only served as a distraction. He needed to focus. Momo wasn't there to make gas masks. They needed to get out of there before they joined the list of heroes that died in battle. He wasn't ready to die, not yet. I will kill you. You've killed too many of my friends. You can't take Bakugo too. He grabbed Bakugo's arm and started carrying him away. Deku only laughed. It was a futile attempt. There wasn't anywhere to go. The only ones left of them were in the remains of Yue, trying to plan out a course of action. Bakugo just had to go out and try. He'd snuck out and Kirishima woke up and followed him. It had become a mess. Well, Kirishima, I'll be waiting for the day where you can defeat me. The look on Deku's face was one that he'd never forget, the icy glare, the complete lack of remorse. It was like there was nothing left in Deku, a hollow shell with only one purpose, destruction. He wondered if Deku ever were more than that, if he'd ever felt joy, ever had anyone that cared about him. Even if he didn't, that could never justify what he'd done to the world. It didn't take long for Kirishima to realize that they had no chance of escape. The gas surrounded them. He could feel himself stop breathing. He had to resist the urge to drop Bakugo and claw at his own throat, to breathe in. He held in his breath and continued onward, but he never made it very far. He woke up covered in sweat, his lungs desperately grasping for air. It felt as though the poison still filled his lungs. He reached a hand up to his throat to try and remind himself that he wasn't dying, that he was okay. Bakugo wasn't there. That meant that the time travel was real and he was still in the past. He swept the back of his hand against his forehead and frowned at the sight of the beads of water. Bad dream? He heard someone say. He looked over to see Midoriya standing in the kitchen staring at him. He felt his body freeze. For a moment he was certain his heart had stopped. He frowned at the sight of Deku, the younger version of someone he hated so much. Even after everything he'd seen, he couldn't quite convince himself that this Izuku technically wasn't the same as the villain. If they failed at their task, then he would. But they wouldn't fail, he knew they couldn't. That was why they were there. Yeah, a bad dream. He stood up and walked to the sink, rinsing his face off. Can I ask you something? Midoriya nodded. He leaned against the counter. He had a cup in his hand, inside was hot tea. Kirishima wasn't exactly sure why he was asking advice from the person he was needing the advice for, but he had no one else to ask. Besides, if Midoriya ever did find out the truth, then it'd only make sense that Kirishima would get his opinion. They wouldn't let him find out though, they couldn't risk anything. I know this guy, he did some really bad things. He killed a lot of people that I cared about, but now he doesn't even know he did any of that. Would you ever be able to forgive him? Midoriya looked down at the ground. Are you saying that he has amnesia, he'd forgotten everything? Kirishima nodded. I don't know if I could, even if he doesn't remember. To him, he'd never done it, but he has the potential to do it again. He'd done it before, he could easily do it again. He sighed, slightly repeating himself at the end. It seemed he was thinking of something from his own life to answer the question. He wondered if it was Bakugo. It's all up to if you can truly forgive him or not, but I don't think it would be easy to do so. Yeah, that's what I thought. He sighed and rubbed his eyes. The situation was a bit different than what he described to Midoriya, but he had to at least try and change it a bit. He knew the kid was smart, so he didn't want to risk revealing what the truth was. I want to ask you something. Kirishima tensed up, turning to look at Midoriya. Why are you all actually here? He asked. He set down his cup of tea and dug his hands in the pocket of his hoodie. I know that what Kaminari said was just made up on the spot. I don't think you have bad intentions, I just want to know. Kirishima blinked, he almost forgot to breathe. Apparently Kaminari wasn't a great liar, and neither were they. What makes you think we were lying? Two of you were fumbling for a reason, the rest of you had this blank look. None of you knew what to say. He shook his head. Everyone always lies to me. I know what lying looks like. It also wouldn't make sense that UA would send their future students on a field trip across the country and not give them a supervisor or a place to stay. He had to admit, it wouldn't take a genius to figure that out. They weren't exactly trying to give their best lie, and Denki had just offered a rushed suggestion. But Kirishima couldn't tell Midoriya why they were really there. He didn't know what the boy would do. I can't tell you the real reason, I'm sorry. He wasn't sure if he actually was sorry or not. But I don't think it's anything you need to worry about. Midoriya didn't say anything in response, only staring at the ground with eyes that showed he wasn't even aware of the floor he was staring at. He was thinking, maybe trying to figure out the truth based on the little information he knew. He was analytical, it was a well-known fact. When Deku first arose as a villain, his role in the league was strategy. He'd watch heroes fight, figure out every detail of their quirks, and share that information with the league. That apparently included Kirishima's class. He'd watched each villain attack and each sports festival. He knew every way to beat each of them, and they didn't even know his quirk. It made sense now, knowing that he didn't have a quirk until inheriting All for One. It took several more hours for everyone to wake up. By that point Izuku had gone off to school and Inko had left the apartment. They decided to spend their time conjuring up a plan, because they weren't even sure what they were doing. He knows we lied about why we're here. They all looked up from the TV. Denki groaned. Yeah, figured as much. I keep forgetting that as a villain, he was the smartest man alive. It'd only make sense for him to be smart as a kid too. He sulked for a moment, leaning his head back against the couch. We need to take a different approach to this. You're right. We've just been sitting around and watching Midoriya, but we need to also look at the environment around him. Shoto sat up and looked out the window. It was a sunny April day. We need to watch Bakugo too. Yesterday, several parents across Japan have claimed their children have gone missing. This includes the son of number 2 hero Dash. Shinso turned off the TV, leaving them in silence. They wondered how badly they were fucking up their own lives in this timeline. They hadn't even considered it. None of them had answered any calls from their parents, didn't even acknowledge them when they'd set out for Aldra. If what they were doing would change the future, then they needed to handle their own lives as well. They just weren't used to having to worry about parents again. They'd been adults for so long and lived on their own for just as long. It didn't make sense for them to consider that at first. We need to split up, separate groups that will watch over either Bakugo or Midoriya. Momo stood up and pulled out her phone. Meanwhile, there's something I need to take care of. What exactly would that be? Mina asked, a brow raised. It wasn't out of the ordinary for Momo to be vague, and things always worked out in the end, but even so, it wasn't the time to be secretive. In this timeline, all of our former teachers are still alive. I think I could convince a few of them to believe me and help ensure what we accomplish will stay that way. Okay, so who will be in which group? Uraraka asked. Kirishima could tell that she wasn't all that thrilled with either group. Momo cupped her chin with her thumb and index finger, a look of pure concentration. Those who stay close to Midoriya will be Ochako, Shinso, and Shoto. With Bakugo will be Eijiro, Denki, and Mina. Kirishima nodded. He was fine with that. Maybe he'd be able to convince Katsuki to be a better person and not take anger out on quirkless kids. I'm going to head out right now. I'd like to find everyone I'm looking for in good timing. Momo stood up and walked towards the guest bedroom. I may be gone for a few days, so just explain to the Midoriyas that I'm away to go help out my parents with something and that I may or may not return. She walked out of the room with her bag in hand, then headed for the door where her shoes were sat waiting for her. Her face held a focused gaze, one that was deep in thought. Each of you are great strategists, so I'll trust that you'll figure out a good way to handle your tasks. She had put her shoes on, her hand now nearing the doorknob. I'll see you all soon. With that, Momo was gone. They all hoped she'd succeed in her task, but they also had their own to think of. Getting Midoriya down a different life path wouldn't be simple, not without essential information of what all the causes of his villainy was. They're both at school right now, so we should probably wait until school ends. It's not like we can go there, especially when our faces are being broadcast on the news. Shoto let out a hefty sigh and stared at the ceiling. Ida made this sound so much easier than the reality of it. Yeah, well, Ida said we should kill him, Denki pointed out, and I think we all can agree that killing him wouldn't do anything good for us. I mean Dash. Mina. Sorry. Mina giggled, just joking. But seriously Dash, Shinso yawned and sat up. We don't have time to wait for them to get out of school every day. We don't know what is set to happen that'll cause Midoriya to become what we know him as. For all we know, we could already be too late. Kirishima had to agree, sitting around wouldn't do them any good. Momo was already started with her own task, one they didn't quite understand but knew would benefit them. So, how exactly will we get closer to Bakugo? We know nothing about him from when he was a kid, not even his address, he asked. Mrs. Midoriya knows where he lives. Momo told me that when she spoke with Mrs. Midoriya, she told her that they were apparently childhood friends and that she was friends with Bakugo's mom. Uraraka mentioned, even if Midoriya won't tell you, his mom would. Kirishima exchanged a glance with Denki. They both nodded. They'd fix everything, they'd prevent the mess that would soon occur. They just needed to hurry. Momo didn't realize that Midoriya lived in the same town as UA High, but it made the whole situation a lot more chilling. He was right there, in the same town as the high school she went to, for who knows how long. The walk to UA wasn't all that difficult, though the town was large. It was easy to get lost in the many streets that all looked identical. There was also that feeling of being followed. She was unsure of who it could be. She was a young girl walking alone through the streets. She'd forgotten of the dangers she'd be in. As a pro-hero, she'd gained a lot more respect, though her body was still a big point of discussion. Men had more dignity than to be a creep towards someone like her, who could easily kick their asses. She decided to let the person follow her. Her younger self could still fight fairly well if needed. She'd be fine, though she'd still worry. UA was close. She could see the main entrance nearing closer as she fastened her pace. She knew Aizawa would be there, but she worried about finding All Might. He'd be tricky. Once she arrived at the gates, she realized that she had no way in. Only UA students and staff could enter, and she was no longer either one. She could try and reason with Nedzu, maybe he'd believe her and let her in. She doubted it though, he'd surely think the concept was absurd. Don't even bother with trying to get their attention, a familiar voice spoke. I already tried. Momo widened her eyes and didn't let herself turn around. The voice was unmistakable, it couldn't belong to anyone else. But why exactly was he there? Mineta, I'm going to guess that you're not from this timeline. She turned around, his terribly short toddler body was shorter than ever. That creepy face that always stared at his female classmates was covered with a smug grin. She'd forgotten how much she hated his younger self. What are you doing here? He chuckled. I'm here to save the day. No need to thank me. How did you get here? You weren't chosen and I didn't see you when Eri was sending us back. I managed to convince her to let me go back. I've been here for a few days now. I couldn't find any of you, so I've just been trying to find Aizawa. Looks like you had the same idea. Momo sighed and nodded, but it seems like you've had no luck either. I may have an easier time with this than you will. Mineta raised a brow. But he didn't need to ask. Momo had been recommended for the hero course long before she took the recommendation exam. She knew she'd met a few of the teachers by then, though she couldn't quite remember which ones. It was funny how much memories are lost over the years. Whole segments of her life gone from her mind. It seemed unfair. She gazed at Mineta once more. He'd definitely been the one following her. She was guessing that he was trying to make sure she wasn't the Momo of the timeline they were in before he approached her. He'd gotten a lot smarter over the years, a lot more considerate and less of a pervert. She'd be lying if she said that he completely stopped with his old ways though. He still had his moments, but he'd gotten better about his behavior. He'd found his purpose of being a hero, a better reason than to get girls to like him. He wanted to fight against the war, though his cowardly behavior didn't do him much with that. We need to speak with Aizawa and All Might. The others have found both Bakugo and Midoriya. I don't think you should get involved. Stay near you and find All Might. That's all I want you to do. Momo didn't like the idea of him being part of their team. He didn't have any abilities that could help them. That was why he hadn't been chosen to be there, after all. He couldn't interact with kids very well, let alone adults. His quirk was helpful sometimes, but not there, and especially not when his body wasn't able to handle how he'd use it in the future. He'd have to retrain his body, which could take years. That's what I've been doing anyways, Mineta sighed. Oh, and by the way, Eri wanted you to know that she's still unsure of what'll happen after you complete your goal. She'd been trying to get Bakugo to wake, he wouldn't budge. She's also training her quirk with Lemillion, trying to see the cause and effect. They haven't tried anything too impactful, so maybe that's why. Momo nodded. It wasn't any new information. She didn't like how complicated the situation was becoming. Aizawa knew a storm when he saw one, and there definitely was one coming. He could sense that something was wrong, that something bad was to happen. He didn't know what, and he honestly didn't care to find out. He had enough to worry about with his teaching. He didn't need another bother in his life. You want to teach here? He mumbled. He was tapping the bottom of his pen to the surface of the table. I would indeed. My golden days are long gone. It's my time to help train the next gen. All Might had began, but Aizawa was too tired to deal with all the noise. Yeah. I'd rather not hear the speech. Aizawa decided that All Might may be the start of the storm. Villains may try to go after him. The next 1A class was going to be rather unlucky, he could tell that much. Stop following me, you extras. Kaminari chuckled. A young Bakugo had an even bigger superiority complex than he could ever imagine. He couldn't quite remember how much that showed during their first year at UA, but he could imagine that it still existed. Come on dude, we just want to talk. Kirishima followed behind Bakugo closely, trying to catch up with his speed. They all forgot how energetic being young was, how much easier it was to do everything. Kaminari just wished that his younger self had hit the gym a bit more often. He felt so much weaker in strength. That was always one of the things pulling him back in UA. His classmates all had trained their bodies within the first year, but he'd never really considered it for himself. He'd always figured his quirk didn't need it. Talk to someone else. Fucking shitty hair. Kirishima had made sure to spike up his hair and dye it as soon as he found an ounce of free time. He couldn't stand not feeling like himself even more than he already was. Kaminari didn't feel the need to make any big appearance changes, though he did wish he could have his hero costume. Unfortunately, it didn't exist yet. You can't keep running forever. Mina had been treating it like a game, which was probably the better idea. Bakugo was actually a teen, but they were all mentally 25. Maybe treating it like a game would make him listen. We just need to talk. Bakugo stopped walking. which caused Kirishima to come to a quick halt so as not to slam right into Bakugo's back. The tempered blonde turned around with a pissed-off glare that reminded Kaminari of the old Bakugo. "What? Are you trying to lecture me into leaving Deku alone?" He crossed his arms. "You're even dumber than I thought." "Why is that?" Kirishima asked. "That worthless piece of trash wants to be a hero. Someone has to show him that he'll never make it a day. It's better to crush his dreams before he has to realize it himself." Bakugo let his arms fall to his sides. "Besides, even if I do, that won't stop the rest of the world." It was silent for a moment. The three heroes tried to process what he'd tried to imply. "Wait, Kaminari narrowed his eyes as he gazed at the concrete ground in front of him. "What are you trying to say? Have you never met a quirkless kid before?" Bakugo was staring at him like he was pathetic. It was such a demeaning look that Kaminari wasn't quite used to. Was this how Midoriya felt? "No, not really. They're pretty rare these days." Bakugo rolled his eyes and turned back around. "I don't owe you an explanation. Figure it out yourselves." This time, they let him walk away. "Ijiro, we can try again later." Mina sighed and looked over at the school building, tons of students leaving the doors and on their way home for the day. "I have a feeling that this isn't just an issue with Bakugo. I mean, that's literally what he just implied, so Oh, shut up, I'm just saying." Shinso leaned against the wall of the school, his eyes gazing past each student who walked by. Todoroki and Uraraka had been waiting for Deku. They stood by the path they knew he'd take to walk home. Shinso had other plans, so he waited elsewhere. Teachers were fairly simple to spot, all walked by with purpose. Some carried briefcases and wore button-up shirts paired with cheap ties. Some wore brown blazers on top of that, which was most of the teachers he'd seen walk by thus far. He was looking for one in particular, Midoriya's teacher. All he knew was that the man had blonde hair, and he hadn't seen any teachers with blonde hair yet. It would have been so much easier if he was a pro-hero still, but entering a school without permission, especially with a quirk like his, he'd pass on trying to enter that building. The teacher would have to leave eventually, and he was willing to wait. Turns out that he didn't have to wait as long as he'd planned, because the blonde teacher stepped out those doors 10 minutes later. Shinso straightened his posture and walked over to the man. "Excuse me," he began, catching the teacher's attention. "One of your students is Izuku Midoriya, correct?" The man nodded slowly. A hint of suspicion crossed his face. "I just wanted to let you know he's being bullied by a kid named Katsuki Bakugo." The man glared at him now, almost seeming enraged by Shinso even speaking. "The business of my students is nothing for you to concern yourself with." He started walking. "Have a good day. Stay out of trouble." "Sir," Shinso groaned. He hated this guy. "You know, of course, everyone picks on Midoriya." He stopped walking again and crossed his arms. "But that's just how life is for quirkless kids. Doesn't mean you shouldn't stop it." The teacher spoke in a way that felt so condescending, like Shinso was just a speck of dirt to him. It honestly reminded him of his own childhood, his quirk being deemed villainous by his peers and teachers. At least sometimes his teachers tried to get the other kids to stop, but Midoriya's teacher seemed like he didn't care at all. "Look, kid, Midoriya doesn't have a future in the hero world, but the rest of my students do. If I do anything, then I'm just tossing away the reputations of these kids who could become strong heroes." It was sickening to see him justify what he was allowing, what he was contributing to. "Yeah, but what about Midoriya? How do you think this will impact him?" The teacher didn't say anything, and he looked like he honestly didn't care. The man walked away without another word, leaving Shinso to himself at the now empty school. How the hell were they supposed to fix an entire society? "Thanks for trying." Shinso looked up and his eyes met the green-haired boy himself. "I can't even get myself to talk back to anyone, so that means a lot." Shinso nodded, though he didn't reply. He stared at how exhausted Midoriya looked, how miserable he seemed. He wasn't the same person as the villain he once could be. No, he was just a defenseless boy who was stuck in a world that didn't care if he was alive or not. That was the thing about villains. Some are made to be how they are because of their misfortunes, some are born destined to be villains. Izuku Midoriya was not destined for that, but he had become stronger than the rest even so. "Why are you so nice to me?" Midoriya asked. they began to walk back to the apartment. Shoto and Uraraka had surely headed back after so long of waiting. Why are all of you so nice? I don't get it, you come out of nowhere and dash. We all want to be heroes one day, the best of the best. We're not like Bakugo, we know what being a hero really means. He sighed. He was acting like his Bakugo and this Bakugo were two different people. The Bakugo from his timeline was a true hero. He cared about people and was determined to save the world from the villains. This Bakugo seems like all he wanted was glory and respect. But really, they were the same person. Kacchan would make a good hero. Midoriya rubbed his eyes. He didn't look up at Shinso, he stared at the ground in concentration. Right now, well, he's strong. He just needs to learn to be kinder to people. Hearing him say that almost broke Shinso's heart. He didn't hate Bakugo, he had every reason to, but he didn't. Not yet, anyways. You call him Kacchan? He nodded. We used to be friends when we were little. He had this whole group of us where we'd all call him that, especially after he got his quirk and all of us treated him like a leader. What changed? Was it when you found out that you were quirkless? No, he shook his head. He didn't care that I was quirkless at first, not until he fell into a river and I tried to help him up. That's when he started being mean. He avoided me at first, but I kept trying to apologize and try to mend our friendship. Bakugo bullied Midoriya relentlessly for years, all because he tried to help him out of a river? No, that wasn't it. Bakugo must have misread the situation, must have thought Midoriya was trying to say he was weak. That was always something Bakugo couldn't stand. He'd always made sure everyone knew he was strong. But still, years and years of hatred for one small incident? Why does he call you Deku? You don't seem to like it, so I'm guessing it's not the nickname he gave you when you were still friends? Midoriya looked up at him for the first time in minutes. It's a different reading of my name. He says it means worthless. Useless, one who can't achieve or do anything. It's fitting, I guess. Shinso mentally noted to tell the others later, he couldn't think properly. He'd probably do well getting some rest, especially because he'd spent the night going through the hero notebooks on Izuku's bookshelf. Maybe, just maybe, they could get him into UA with only analytical talent alone. Hello, I'm Momo Yaoyorozu, it's nice to meet you. She smiled at Nezu, who only stared at her. He was trying to assess her intentions, figure out if she was a villain or not. My instructors told me that they've already sent over my recommendation letters, is that correct? He nodded, yes, we've received them and reviewed them. The exam won't be for a while though, so I'm sure that's not what you're here to discuss. She held her breath for a moment, her every action could completely change the future. She needed to ensure that she convinced them. You're correct, that isn't any of my worries at the moment. I'm here because there's something I must warn you of. Izawa and All Might were in the room, silently listening from the chairs in the corner of the room. Principal Nezu sat at his own desk, his full attention on her. All Might was in his weakened form. She wasn't sure if using that knowledge would benefit her or put a target on her back. Her mind was nulling to a blank when she tried to think of the best way to word it. What I am here to tell you is hard to believe, but I beg of you to hear me out all the way through. I come from the future, one where a horrid war has taken place. I'm here to prevent the same mistakes from being made, to prevent our biggest enemy from becoming a villain in the first place. Izawa and Nezu kept their stoic expression, though All Might noticeably seemed confused. I'm sure you are all aware that in this current timeline, a villain named All for One is of the biggest concern, but he soon finds his successor. She looked at All Might. This successor isn't someone any of us are able to beat. Not even you, All Might. He coughed, blood coming out of his mouth as his eyes widened in shock at her. Izawa interrupted him. Now isn't the time for us to ask questions. We agreed to hear her out. I intend to do so. She nodded. Right now, he's just a quirkless kid who is being shunned by society for what he cannot change. My friends and I have all come back to this specific time. We're working hard to prevent the future. We can't do this alone though. We are unsure of what this time travel can do, or how the changes will show themselves. What exactly did he do in your timeline? All Might asked. He seemed the most skeptical out of everyone. Maybe he suspected her as a villain, maybe trying to trick them. She could understand that. Izawa seemed tired, almost hoping it was all a lie so that he didn't have to deal with whatever was to come. Nezu just listened. He didn't speak much and didn't dare show an ounce of reaction. She couldn't honestly remember much about the Nezu from her timeline, but part of her was worried about his intentions. She was hesitant to answer his question. There was a lot that Deku had done. Knowing his past, it was easy to make some connections. He hated quirks. He wanted to show the world how harmful they could be and how reliant everyone was on a hero society. His way of showing this, it wasn't going to work. He had to know that, but Momo wanted to believe that he'd lost any decency or humanity left in him after getting All for One. His mind only wanted power. He became one with his leader. He turned Japan into ruins. Most died and the survivors were just hiding from the League. Any heroes left spent their remaining days trying to fight, but there was no use. It was silent for a moment. They were considering her claim. If we are to believe you, what exactly are you suggesting we do? Nezu asked. We try and set him up on the path of being a hero. He may be quirkless now, but his analytical skills are at the level of pro heroes. He could do well in the support course. She wasn't even sure if it'd work, and she wasn't sure how the media would react to a quirkless hero. It might just make everything worse, but it was better than not trying at all. Maybe it'd be better to get him to be an underground hero, like Aizawa was. There's a lot that we still need to find out. When we all were sent back, we hadn't heard of any details surrounding his past. We'd been told to kill him, which isn't something that needs to be done. Aizawa raised a brow. His arms were crossed around his chest and eyes giving the same blank stare that he had for the entire meeting. There were several of us sent back. Right now I have them divided into 2 groups of 3. One group will watch over Izuku Midoriya, the other will watch over a boy named Katsuki Bakugu. What's so important about Katsuki Bakugu? All Might asked. He's our future #1 hero, but currently he's a bully to Midoriya. We are under the belief that this bullying aided in Midoriya's growing hatred and path to villainy. She wasn't sure how telling them that information would impact the timeline. She respected Bakugu a lot as a person and hero, and as a kid she couldn't seem to treat them as the same person. The Bakugu she knew had done all of the things that the younger version did. There was no difference. Bakugu is a great hero in the future, and I want you to keep that in mind when you may interact with him. I don't know what causes him to treat Midoriya so poorly, but I want to help him learn to change. // // / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / //. People were selfish by nature, it was just something that everyone tried to hide. In reality, everyone yearned to have it all. The difference between the good and the bad was morality. Would you do whatever it took to get what you wanted? Or would you only do what you are morally able to? Izuku wasn't quite sure which he'd do, especially if it meant getting a quirk. His whole life he'd waited for one, even though he'd known for a while that it'd never show up. He'd make these fantasies in his head of finding out that it was there all along, that magically it'd appear. Unfortunately, quirks usually found ways to show themselves by early childhood. He was a teenager now, it was time to grow up. He was selfish, he'd admit that much. He wanted it all, but he didn't think he'd betray his own moral code just for his life to be less shitty. Bakugo was selfish, he wanted to be the strongest there ever was. He wanted to be on All Might's level and he didn't seem to care about morals. These random people who showed up? He wasn't quite sure about them. Maybe they truly wanted to help him, to be kind and heroic. Or maybe they had their own selfish intentions, maybe they didn't actually want to help him, but they felt that they had to. After all, he still didn't know why they were there, they even lied to him. There was way more to the story than he could see at the surface. He planned on figuring it out. He couldn't stand the conflict within him. They seemed nice enough though, especially Shinso. He seemed to care a lot more than the others, he seemed genuinely concerned over the matter. The others were concerned, sure, but they were more focused on something else. They were trying to figure something out, maybe even plan something. He'd been having these dreams lately, ones he couldn't quite understand. He could see them all, older versions, and it seemed like they were in a battle. Right before his dream showed who they were fighting, he'd always wake up. Sometimes Bakugo would be there, older and in a hero costume. He seemed less angry. "You gonna eat?" Shinso asked. They were sitting in Midoriya's kitchen while the others said they needed to do something. He was curious as to what that was, but he didn't have enough time to ask. He nodded slowly, staring down in the plate of food that was left over from the night before. He sighed and began to eat. From the corner of his eye, he could see Shinso staring at him with a calculating gaze. Kids always pick on me for my quirk. They say it would be perfect for a villain. That I will end up being one, but I've always wanted to be a hero. He spoke, his eyes showed only the smallest amount of emotion. This society isn't made for people like you and I, but that doesn't mean we should give up on our dreams. Izuku nodded, though he wasn't exactly convinced. You want to be a hero, right? Shinso asked. I used to. You still can, even without a quirk. Shinso noticed that the statement didn't fully get through to him. There was someone else he needed to hear it from. It wasn't him, that was for sure. He doubted it was Bakugo either. The guy didn't seem to mean a whole lot to Izuku. He decided that he'd dwell on the topic later when he wasn't with the boy. It'd be easier that way. Yeah, maybe. Izuku sighed and picked at his food. He didn't expect anything to change. He'd accepted his fate for the most part. Sometimes he'd still see himself daydreaming of following the hero path, but it wasn't meant to be. Nothing was really meant to be for him. Shinso would later find Midoriya cleaning his room when the others were still out. He wasn't sure if the feeling in his gut had anything to do with that, but he didn't like the situation at all. He was getting creeped out by them already. It wasn't that he didn't like the way they were trying to help, but Izuku kept noticing that they knew things he'd never told them. On top of that, the only three that consistently stayed around him were Uraraka, Todoroki, and Shinso. He didn't know where the others kept going, but he was certain it had something to do with why they were actually there. He wanted to find that out, but none of them would tell him. To make matters worse, he had to start thinking about high school. He'd always wanted to go to UA, the school where All Might went. He knew he wouldn't get in, and his classmates made sure he knew that fact. Still, trying wouldn't hurt, right? If he made it in, he'd be the world's first quirkless hero. That would be a huge step towards getting the quirkless people more respect. But still, he knew it wasn't going to end well. Tomorrow he'd have to submit his list of high schools he wanted to try and get into. In the first slot was an abundance of eraser marks and scribbles over UA. He wasn't sure if it'd be a good idea to do so. Who knew if his teacher would share that information with the class? He was walking through town in hopes of seeing a villain attack. If he were lucky, he'd get to see a new hero debut. It was April, a class at UA had graduated and were starting to debut. Hey, you there? A voice spoke. Izuku turned around. Yeah, do you know where Aldra Junior High is? The boy was strange looking, not that Izuku thought it was a bad kind of strange or anything. His hair was a group of purple balls that looked like they might detach. A quirk, from the looks of it. He was incredibly short, which Izuku wondered if he was his age or if he was a kid. It's across town, actually. East of here. The boy stared at him, almost like he was terrified. Izuku turned around to see if any villains were nearby, but it was just them. Are you all right? The boy blinked, widening his eyes and composing himself. Oh, yeah, I'm great. Name's Mineta, I'm a pro dash. Whatever he was about to say was stopped. He seemed to rethink what he needed to speak. I'm probably really lost. Can you show me where the school is? Dean, what's your name again? Izuku had a feeling that Mineta was about to say Deku, but he'd never met this kid in his life. Izuku Midoriya, I'm a student at Aldra so I can show you. Mineta chuckled in an extremely awkward way. He seemed to be panicking almost, which was strange. Sounds great. Lead the way, Midoriya. He nodded and started heading to the place of all his misery for the second time that day. It wasn't exactly his plan, but Izuku liked to be helpful. Are you a transfer student? He ended up asking, his curiosity getting the better of him. It was starting to become routine in finding someone who seemed to know who he was, apparently. No, not really. My family moved to town to work. You're a bad liar, you know, Izuku mumbled. It was just loud enough for Mineta to hear. He didn't mean for it to come off as rude, but he could tell Mineta didn't enjoy hearing him say that. Izuku was just so tired of being lied to. Hey, he whined. For your information, I just so happen to be a strong hero. I could take you down right here right now. Your dash. Izuku furrowed his brows. A hero? How old are you? Oh, you know I'm your age. And how old is that? Izuku was tempted to laugh. The guy was a pathological liar from the looks of it. Or maybe he had something to hide, who knows? He surely didn't, and he doubted he would. That was okay with him. He wasn't all too concerned with Mineta's life. Not important. I need to find my friends. I think they'll be at Aldra. Can we hurry it up? Mineta began to quicken his pace, but Izuku slowly walked behind him. Midoriya. Come on, you're the one showing me where it is. You shouldn't be so slow. Mineta, can I ask you something? Sure. You wouldn't happen to be looking for a group of people our age? One of their names is Shinso. There's also Todoroki and Yaoyorozu. Oh. Mineta grinned creepily, a plan probably conjuring up in his mind. You know them. Have you seen them anywhere? Izuku sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, so he was one of them. Yeah. I can take you to them, but what's the reason you all are here? Mineta tilted his head slightly and shrugged. Dunno, we were just told to come here. He wasn't sure if it was truthful or not, but he didn't have time to obsess over body language and tone of voice. He had more to worry about, especially his decision for what career path to choose. So, you want to be a hero too? Izuku asked, looking over at Mineta. Yeah. I'm gonna be a great hero, I just know it. Plus, imagine all the girls. She frowned and shook his head. There's so much I could do. My quirk may seem weird now, but I'll improve it. Izuku nodded, looking over in the distance. Sunset would be soon upon them. // Okay, so say Midoriya were just sitting down at his desk and writing in one of his notebooks, what do you do? Shut up. Kirishima sighed, leaning back against the wall of the school. They'd managed to get Bakugo to stay with them, but getting him to cooperate was difficult. Kirishima just wanted him to realize he was an absolute asshole to Midoriya. Was that too much to ask for? Come on, you gotta lay off of him. He's just a defenseless, quirkless kid. If you want to be a hero, then you have to act like one. Kirishima groaned when he realized Bakugo wasn't understanding the bigger picture. Stubborn, he'd always been stubborn. He slumped down and rested his chin on his palm. Dude, I can't be your therapist forever. Bakugo seemed to hate that, frowning even more than before. He kneeled down and grabbed the collar of Kirishima's shirt. I don't need a therapist. I don't need your help. Do you? Shut up. Bakugo released the shirt from his hands and watched Kirishima fall back to the ground. You can't tell me how to live my life. I'm doing just fine. Then why? He sat up, no longer slouching. Mina and Denki were watching from afar, trying to figure out a backstory for the rage within Bakugo. He hoped they'd found a logical reason. Why are you so hostile to everyone around you? You always think you're better, but you're not. I don't get it. What is making you act like this, dude? The air felt thin, one noise and they'd suffocate. Kirishima watched as Bakugo sighed. He seemed less tense. He was going to speak. He breathed in, the suffocating feeling going away. None of these people will matter when I become a hero. I won't see any of them ever again. They don't have what it takes to get into UA. I don't owe them my kindness. He stared at Kirishima with confusion, his brows furrowed as he tried to figure something out. The anger problems just run in the family. It's as simple as that. Geez, it's all I with you. You know, not everything is about you. Kirishima wasn't sure if he would have called future Bakugo out for something like that. He wasn't sure if he ever really noticed any of this behavior after UA. Sure, while they were students he was more similar, but not this bad. If you want to be the #1 hero so bad, you have to also be a good person. The statement had definitely gotten through to Bakugo, though it was a mystery if he'd listen. Only time would tell. What's the deal with you losers anyways? Don't think I haven't noticed you all hanging around Deku a lot, and then you three try to talk to me about being a better person? He rolled his eyes. I don't know what he told you to do. He didn't tell us anything. Kirishima raised his arms defensively. Bakugo was extremely defensive, especially when it came to his strength and fiery attitude. Did Bakugo feel inferior to those around him? So much so that he get the need to prove himself wrong constantly? You know what, if you're so strong, prove it to me. Bakugo smirked. You a skin for a fight? Denki and Mina ran over to him and stepped between the two. Hey, how about no? Denki's eyes were wide as he tried to separate the two. It was too late. Kirishima had a plan. Bakugo was activating his quirk, and Kirishima realized he'd have to hold back. Sure, if he were actually 13 then he would easily lose, but he'd gotten years of experience and knowledge since then. He knew how to use his quirk. Bakugo was still a junior high student with no other experience. Come on guys, there are better ways of doing this. Mina stared at Kirishima in hopes of him understanding, and he did, but he knew this was the only way to get Bakugo to listen. Bakugo ran around Denki and Mina, landing right in front of Kirishima. He activated his own quirk and used his arms to block the explosion. Bakugo frowned upon realization that his explosions gave no damage. He tried again, and each result was the same. Kirishima's arms were clear of any marks. You gonna stay on defense forever? Bakugo stepped back, readying another explosion. He had a point, they could go on forever at that rate. Bakugo wouldn't let himself lose, and Kirishima could dodge those attacks with little exhaustion. The fight would only end when Bakugo was too exhausted to conjure another explosion. Not planning on it, he waited for the moment that Bakugo would strike again, then hardened his arm and landed a punch right on Bakugo's jaw. Bakugo went through with his attack, Kirishima quickly hardening his other arm and blocking the explosion. He immediately threw another punch. Bakugo quickly moved out of the way and grinned. I'll do this all day if I have to, you won't win this. Kirishima sighed, he figured as much. He was hoping them being an equal match would prove his point enough, but it seemed to be that it wasn't the case. He glanced over at Mina and Denki, motioning them to join him in the fight. It was time for Plan B. Denki set off a mild voltage of electricity, not enough to hurt Bakugo, but enough to disorient him. It didn't stop Bakugo for long. He quickly charged up another explosion and went to attack Denki. Mina quickly made a shield with her acid and stepped between them, watching as Bakugo's attack was nullified. She looked over at Kirishima and nodded. He nodded back and hardened his arms. Denki and Mina were keeping him busy, but Kirishima was certain that Bakugo would notice him. He had to act fast, and so he ran behind Bakugo as he tried another attack, then shoved him downwards as much as he could. Bakugo fell forward, his chest landing on the ground. Kirishima grabbed his arms and pointed them towards Bakugo's back. If he tried using his quirk, he'd only hurt himself. What was that about winning? Kirishima grinned. Hein Ijiro, he's dash, Denki began, eyes wide. Kirishima looked down and Bakugo's hands. He was about to do another explosion. Kirishima quickly let go of him and let him stand. He stared at Bakugo with concern. The fight has only just begun, Bakugo spat. Do dash, Kirishima frowned. His quirk was no longer in use. If I hadn't let go, you would have burned yourself. What scared Kirishima the most was the fact that the idea didn't even bother Bakugo. So, if you were a villain, I'd have to make any sacrifice necessary to defeat you. No, Bakugo, that's not how it should be. Kirishima watched as Bakugo stopped his own quirk and shoved his hands in his pockets. You're just going to get yourself killed doing that. Tich, what do you know? Who even are you? His gaze passed between Denki, Mina, and Ijiro. Am I too strong to fight on your own, eh? Didn't know we were allowed backup? In a fight, teaming up is the best way to go. You can't fight every battle alone, you need friends. Mina frowned. If you keep bullying Dash, what are you implying? That I should stop bullying Deku and team up with him? He spat. Last I checked, the kid is quirkless. I have people I could team up with if needed, though they all have shitty and useless quirks. I'm best on my own. If you can't get over your own ego and use teamwork, then you'll never be a hero. Kirishima didn't like this version of Bakugo at all. He was stubborn and had a huge ego. It wasn't quite as bad once he got into UA, but Kirishima wasn't sure if it was because he was around other people with strong quirks, or if it was because something happened to lessen it. If it was the latter, Kirishima had a feeling the event was the same one that caused Midoriya to become a villain. Bakugo's expression became blank, an unreadable canvas. He turned around. Shut up. They watched as he walked away, probably off to go home. They exchanged a worried glance, but Kirishima knew that his words had gotten through to Bakugo. He'd be alright, but he had to process everything. We should head back. I'm sure the others are wondering where we went. Denki put his arms around Mina and Ijiro's shoulders, and they began walking towards the Midoriya apartment. // Thank you for the food, they said in unison. They all sat around the kitchen, some at the dining table and some leaned against the counter. The Midoriyas didn't get guests often, it seemed. Nonetheless, Inko looked ecstatic to have them there. Maybe it was because it meant that Izuku had friends, though Shinso wasn't sure that they were friends. Maybe eventually, but it felt selfish to say they were friends. So, Midoriya dash. Oh, call me Inko. Alright, Uraraka smiled. So, I'm guessing you love to cook? Yes. Inko took a bite of her food. I thought it'd be nice to take up a hobby. Cooking and baking just was super convenient. Oh, convenient in what way? She raised her hand and pointed towards the counter, where they all watched a plate being levitated towards them. You have a levitation quirk? Mina gaped. That's so cool. Well, it only really works with small objects, Inko chuckled, but it's still quite handy. Definitely not a hero quirk or anything. Shinso looked over at Izuku, who was quietly eating his food. He had to wonder if they'd made any difference in the future yet. Would Izuku still become a villain? He assumed so. There was still so much they had to do. Even so, it was hard to believe that someone like him could ever become something so strong and evil. Society does a lot to people. Shinso would know that the best. Is Izuku's father still around? Todoroki asked. Or is it just you two? Shinso watched Izuku's expression change into a blank one. He stared at his mother and stopped eating. A sensitive subject, it seemed. Oh, Inko was avoiding looking at her son. He works overseas, so he sends us a monthly payment for us to live off of. We haven't seen him in years though, not since Izuku was a toddler. Izuku looked down and frowned. Something wasn't quite right about the situation. Shinso wasn't sure what to think. He decided that it was better to question it later and just enjoy the dinner. Turning in a sheet of paper shouldn't be hard, but Izuku always made the smallest things seem like the end of the world. The paper contained a list, one with several high schools written on it in near bullet points. The very first one was for Yua, a pathetic dream of his. His teacher was waiting at his desk for him to hand it to him, an irritated look on the man's face. Izuku turned it upside down, though he knew the teacher would end up reading it anyways. The teacher grabbed it and sighed, continuing down the aisle of desks. Eventually, each sheet of paper had been turned in and the teacher stood at his podium. He looked through several of them while the kids worked on their assignments. Izuku usually did well with assignments, but he found himself unable to think. So much was happening, it was starting to feel overwhelming. You guys are all third years now, the teacher began, the students all looking up at their teacher. So it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures. He slammed the papers onto his podium and let out a chuckle. Now that your high school forms are turned in, it'd make sense for me to hand out these future career forms, but I assume you all want to be heroes. The class all cheered and showed their quirks to one another. Izuku just buried his head into his arms and awaited for the speech to be over. If he were lucky, then no one will end up acknowledging him. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks, I'm sure. But you're forgetting that it's against the rules to use them in school. Teach, come on, teach. Don't lump me in with these losers. Bakugo grinned, his legs up on top of his desk. My quirk is nowhere near as crappy as theirs. Get over yourself. Several classmates yelled back. Bakugo yelled back at them, though not as much spirit as usual. Something was on his mind, though Izuku had no plans to figure out what that would be. Alright, Bakugo, you're planning on going to UA, aren't you? The teacher stared at one of the papers and then looked back up. What? Their acceptance rates are so low. They barely accept anyone. Bakugo smirked. I aced the mock exam. I'm gonna be the only one in this shitty school to get in. One day I'll surpass All Might and become the greatest hero in the world. Oh, Midoriya, aren't you also aiming for UA? The teacher looked up at Izuku, who raised his head from his arms and widened his eyes. It seemed his luck was non-existent. He gulped. The class was laughing at him. Snide whispers were exchanged and icy cold stares were sent his way. Izuku always hated the stares. Midoriya? Please, good grades alone can't get you into the hero program. A classmate scoffed. Besides, they wouldn't take a quirkless loser like you. He frowned. That's not exactly true. I could enter into the general ed, or maybe even the support course. Forget the crappy quirks, Deku, you're quirkless. Bakugo turned towards Izuku and spat. To be at you, you have to be strong and powerful. Do you honestly think you could win in a fight against me? What? NOIC could nev dash Izuku scrambled for words, but memories of Bakuga's explosions only replayed in his mind. Of course not Kaken. It's just been my dream since I was a kid. And I figured dash. You figured what? Bakugo grabbed the collar of his shirt and glared at Izuku. You figured you could be as strong as someone like me? You couldn't even beat any of the weaklings in this classroom, you wouldn't even last a second? Izuku didn't struggle against Bakugo's grip, instead just waiting for the moment when he'd be released. Bakugo stared at him for a moment, no words escaping his mouth. It seemed like he was thinking, something he was doing a lot of lately. It wasn't for another moment when Izuku would be released, he'd land harshly into his seat. He had to bite the inside of his cheek so as to not let out a sob. Lunch break came and went. In that time Izuku had gone off to the bathroom and sat on the floor of one of the stalls. His head was buried in his arms as he listened to the footsteps that occasionally passed by. Maybe his dream really was pathetic. Who was he even kidding? A quirkless kid at UA? He'd be lucky to even secure a regular job. He couldn't offer anything to anyone. A worthless Deku, one who could never achieve anything. He glanced over at his phone, it was time to head back to the classroom. He stood up and wiped the dust from his uniform, then opened the stall and stood in front of the mirror. His eyes were red and puffy, lines clearly streaking down his face. He turned on the sink and held his hands under the water, making sure it wasn't too cold, then lowered his head and splashed the water onto his face. Walking back to the classroom was blissfully quiet. He didn't pass by any of his classmates and the students from other classes didn't acknowledge him. He basked in the peace, though he knew it wouldn't last long. He hadn't had much time alone lately, which wasn't terrible at first. Before his randomly acquired roommates arrived, he'd spent most of his time alone, so talking to them was nice enough. It just felt so constant, so sudden. He opened the door to the classroom and furrowed his brows upon the sight of many classmates crowding his desk. Bakugo seemed to be the only one in a seat. He found himself stopped at the door. He felt nauseated and he knew it couldn't mean anything good. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave. Maybe it'd be better if he never found out what they'd done to his desk. But he knew there were things in life he couldn't avoid, and so he knew he had no choice. He stepped cautiously into the room, then froze when they'd noticed him. Snickers could be heard throughout the crowd, everyone walking back to their seats. Izuku slowly stepped forward, noticing the marks on his desk. The smell of Sharpie was evident. He scrunched his nose with each step. He found himself stood in front of his desk and widened his eyes as he read the words his classmates left for him. Sit down, Midoriya, class is starting. He nodded and sat down, his fingers tracing over each letter of each insult. Things like "you could never be a hero" and "do us all a favor and jump off the roof" were written, as well as the basic insults of quirkless and useless. He couldn't argue with it, they were right. He was everything they said he was. He was selfish to even stay alive. He was just wasting their time. For the first time, he didn't cry over the way his classmates treated him. He couldn't feel anything, a certain numbness consumed him. Maybe it was time to start giving up on that childish dream of being like All Might. / When the final bell rang, Izuku waited behind. He slowly packed all of his belongings into his bag and stared at the final notebook. His current hero analysis notebook. Was it even worth it? Were all those notebooks written for a reason? Or was it just his undying belief that someone so weak and pathetic could ever be at the same level as All Might himself? Deku. He didn't bother looking up. He knew Kaken's voice very well. He didn't wish to see the look of hatred that certainly would be on his face. Deku, look at me. He didn't. Bakugo grabbed his jaw and forced him to look at him. You'll never be a hero, okay? But they took this too far. He let go of Izuku and groaned, the only way you'll ever be a hero is by somehow acquiring a strong quirk overnight. But that's dumb, so just forget it. Find a hobby or some shit, find a better path than being a hero. Just give up on the hero thing. Bakugo walked away after that, leaving Izuku alone in the classroom. He never was one to be good with people, but Izuku thought Bakugo's attempt was almost laughable. The only path for him to be a hero was somehow get a quirk? Pathetic. Izuku really was that pathetic. / It felt like all they ever did was sit around that TV and talk. That was once again the plan, or so Shinso assumed. They'd been talking about their progress with Bakugo, how Kirishima was able to talk to him and get through to him. It sounded almost too good to be true, so Shinso decided it was only a start. They still had a lot of work to do with Bakugo. We bring you breaking news. The hero killer stain has struck again in Chiba. Kirishima frowned and turned the volume down. They'd all forgotten about Stain. In all fairness, the events of Stain had been so minor compared to what came afterwards. Shinso was willing to bet that Ida was the only one who really thought about the hero-killing vigilante anymore. Does anyone remember when Ida went to fight Stain? Denki asked. Wasn't it after the first sports festival? Momo suggested that was when his brother was hospitalized. Shinso didn't know too much about the Hosu incident. He'd been too busy training his ass off, but he'd been told bits and pieces over the years. Ida's brother was almost killed, so he had gone to try and kill the hero killer. Then he'd almost died, but luckily someone had saved him. Ida never knew who. The man had worn a mask over his entire face. He'd been able to get Stain to stop, though they seemed to know one another. Maybe accomplices, and the chilling thought that maybe it was Deku. He shook his head. That wouldn't be something that the villain would have done. Should we do something about it before he kills more heroes? Mina asked, though she seemed hesitant to even suggest the idea. Shinso could understand that playing with the past was problematic. One wrong move and too much changes. They didn't want to change anything more than they had to, which was already down the drain now that most of their parents didn't know their whereabouts. The few that could recall their junior high passcodes were able to give some lame excuses. The rest of them were quickly marked as missing. Shinso always used the same passcode for his phone, so he didn't have any issues calling up his folks. According to them, he was taking a school trip that only the kids with the best grades could attend. They didn't bother to look into it. His younger self never had reason to lie to them. Not now. Maybe if we end up having to relive our first year at UA. We can't cause suspicion, and don't you recall how much trouble Ida got in after that? Momo sighed and leaned back against the couch. Besides, we still have to figure out how to stop Izuku from becoming a villain. Well, seeing how much he hated heroes and society, I guessed that it was something bad. Something that caused him to completely change his opinions. Denki put his thumb to his chin. It can't be the bullying, maybe that helped, but dash. Wait, what if it was All Might? Shoto interrupted, though Denki didn't quite mind. He adores All Might, so something had to have happened between the two of them. Maybe All Might let him down, or even failed to save him. Yeah, but how bad does All Might have to screw up to get Midoriya to become one of the worst villains that Japan has ever seen? Kirishima raised a brow. That has to be incredibly bad. Each teen groaned in the complexity of the situation, though little did they know that the front door was slightly open and the green-haired boy had been standing there. Izuku stepped back from the doorway, the words entering his ears and replying in his mind over and over. Worst villains that Japan has ever seen? No, they couldn't be talking about him. None of them had time travel quirks. They were surely playing a game. He just couldn't convince himself of that, because he was starting to feel like they were truthful. If they really were time travelers, then everything would make sense. The way they'd always follow him around, ask about his life. Try and help him, even trying to get Kaken to ease up on him. The way they were all scared of him at first, and knowing things he'd never told them. So, was he destined to be a villain? He couldn't understand how a quirkless kid could become that, but he didn't want to let that happen. Maybe he'd do everyone a solid and finish their mission off for them without them having to do anything. But part of him was still clinging on to his blissful ignorance he'd had his whole life. There was no way he'd ever be a villain, let alone a strong one. It had to be some sort of prank, right? Ugh, this is so complicated. Let's just get food. Midoriya should be home soon and I don't want him walking in on this conversation. Denki stretched and stood up, then furrowed his brows as he looked around the room. Where'd my Neta go? He was over on the couch last I saw. Uraraka looked over and frowned. Maybe he's in the bathroom? They looked around the apartment, but Mineta was nowhere to be found. The only sign of him was probably the door that was left ajar. // // / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / // Should we trust her? Aizawa asked as he set down a cup of tea in front of his boss. For all we know, she could be siding with the villains. Nedzu sipped at the tea and nodded. I believe it's best that we trust her, though I'm not sure if we should follow her instructions with the quirkless boy. If he's truly destined to bring Japan to ruins, it'd be best to just keep a close eye on him from afar. I fear that bringing him to UA will only bring us constant worry and suspicion. Aizawa wasn't sure of how he'd approach the situation. Personally, he always found time travel strange. There weren't many quirks with that ability, and the fact that these kids were so desperate to prevent this kid from even being a villain? It seemed like bad news. If he really were their teacher, he would have taught them to think of every possible way to win a fight, but never to resort to something improbable. It was obvious that their discovery of time travel was only out of desperation. Not much was probably known. Seeing as he hadn't shown up with them, his future self was surely dead. There was no doubt about that, especially after seeing the look in Yaoyorozu's eyes when she first saw him. But even so, Aizawa couldn't help but worry. He sighed as he pulled out a file he'd obtained from Aldra Junior High. The name Izuku Midoriya was written neatly on the front next to a school photo of the boy. He looked like any average junior high kid, messy green hair and cheeks full of freckles. He held an awkward smile in the picture, one that probably only existed due to the photographer pleading for one as not to get a call from any angry parents. He opened the file and stared at the basic information. There only held one emergency contact, his mother. The quirk section was entirely crossed out, and his grades looked to be all good. There were a few incident reports, some of fights that broke out between him and other kids, though Aizawa was certain that the fights were all one-sided. Not fights at all really. He was just a quirkless kid who society shoved aside. There were many reasons why someone like him would turn to a path of villainy. The one question he had was what the final reason was. What was the final straw for this young Izuku Midoriya? What made him give up on his hopes and dreams and become what he'd once hated most? I'm assuming he only has his mother. No other relatives? Nedzu stopped peering over at the file and sighed. He folded his hands, his paws together and stared at the clock. We should look into his family history. It's hard to believe that a 14-year-old boy could come into contact with villains so easily. Someone around him must be one, either that or a chance encounter. Aizawa nodded and closed the file. He hated kids. It was a wonder why he chose to teach, but he couldn't help but care deeply for his students. Maybe he started his path to villainy all on his own. Either way, there's more to this than just what we are seeing. We can try to prevent Midoriya from his future, but what happens when things go wrong? The damage is already done. Our society has broken him down, and who will be there to stop the next quirkless kid from enduring the same fate? Aizawa rubbed his temples and sighed. Where's All Might? He's out patrolling, I believe. Aizawa nodded and stared out the window. He needed to ask Yaoyorozu more questions. Something wasn't sitting right with him. He didn't know where to go. That wasn't exactly anything out of the ordinary for Izuku Midoriya. He'd always found himself searching for a place of safety. His home usually served that purpose, but he couldn't go back there. He didn't even know what to think anymore. What he'd heard, was it the truth? That was the only question running through his brain. A constant headache that wouldn't go away. He was stuck having to face his own inner conflicts over the matter. Even before overhearing part of that conversation, he'd had his doubts over the purpose of his guests. He sighed, taking out his hero analysis notebook and staring at the cover. He'd done 13 of them so far, each page filled with information he'd spent a long time figuring out. Each battle he'd watched, each news recording from TV, or even the heroes he'd see fight in the UA Sports Festival. So much of his life was spent watching these heroes, even sometimes figuring out things that they didn't know about their own quirks. His analysis skills weren't perfect, but his whole life was spent practicing those skills. He'd improved quickly. But would it all be worth it? When he started writing those notebooks, he'd had the intention of using them to find a way to be a hero. He always thought that maybe he could figure out what quirkless fighting styles could be used best for him. Years later, and he still had no plans for what his life would be. He had no plan B, no second option for when he inevitably gets rejected from UA. But after all the chaos that had taken over his life that week, he wasn't sure he wanted to be a hero anymore. He didn't really want to be anything. He didn't even know if he wanted to try anymore. He slapped his face and snapped himself from his thoughts. No, it wasn't the time to get all depressing. He needed to be rational, he needed to think of his mother. She did everything for him, he was all she had. He had to make her proud, so why would he become a villain? That'd make no sense, his mother would certainly die on the spot if she heard of him going down such a dark path. So it couldn't have been true, probably just a prank they wanted to play on him. Nothing more, and surely nothing less. It only took a matter of seconds before his day got even worse. A slimy substance engulfed his body, trapping his limbs prisoner and slowly covering the bottom half of his face. Izuku tried resisting, tried fighting back against it, but every struggle only resulted in the slime covering him more and more and more. "Don't worry. I'm just hijacking your body," the villain said, though Izuku worried even more after this. What was his quirk? Slime, but what did he mean by hijaki? Calm down. It was a human instinct to struggle against a force that may be causing you harm or preventing you from breathing. Izuku didn't even realize that his hands were clawing at the slime that covered his face, but it was of no use. The slime couldn't be broken by his weak hands, and he could feel himself run out of air. Would this be the end? All of that suffering in his life only to be killed by some villain in a dark alleyway? He couldn't even fight back anymore, his body too weak to let him move. Was it preparing to shut down? Or was it just the lack of air that caused so much pain in his lungs? It'll only hurt for 45 more seconds. Then it'll all be over, so don't worry. The villain cackled, slowly engulfing more and more of Izuku's body in the slime. 45 more seconds? He dying. Fear not, kid, for I am here. 20 seconds. It wasn't enough time. Izuku felt black spots block his vision. The ground began to sway below him as he lost all control over his body. No, it was too late. All Might punched the villain off of him, but Izuku wasn't able to watch the rest of the fight. He slowly fell to the ground, barely able to catch his breath before his eyes closed. All Might was almost too late. The kid almost died, and now he was unconscious on the ground. He wasn't exactly sure of what to do, he was almost at his limit and he couldn't afford to let a random kid see him in his weakened form. He still needed to drop off the villain to the police station too, and then go to UA to speak with Nedzu. He debated trying to shake the boy awake, but he knew that it wouldn't work. So, he sat down and waited. He'd grabbed the boy's notebook and signed the first page. It was only a cover page, it was a hero analysis notebook belonging to an Izuku Midoriya. Tashinori inhaled, slowly flipping to the contents of the notebook. He kept flipping through each page, skimming over each paragraph upon paragraph of information. Each analysis was incredibly spot-on, even going as far to list possible strengths and weaknesses, even suggesting ways that each hero could further utilize his quirk. He then remembered the words Yaoyorozu had spoken when they'd met, that he was quirkless but would become all-for-one successor. This bit of information was valuable, it was their only chance of beating all-for-one in the first place. Stop him before things get worse, but how would they even go about it? He didn't want to believe the young girl at first, but she knew about his quirk and knew what he looked like in his weakened form. That wasn't something that any random junior high student would just know. So he believed her, but he still found it hard to understand how the young Midoriya could find a path of villainy. And why would all-for-one choose him as his successor? There had to be some reason, some small detail. All-for-one thought everything through, he always did, so he must have known that the kid could become strong and powerful. But still Yaoyorozu was saying that they didn't have much time. This kid would come into contact with him soon, so did that mean that the villain already had his eyes on him? Was he watching him from afar? All Might? A weak voice spoke. The boy struggled to sit himself up. Tashinori put on his signature smile and closed the notebook, something that Midoriya didn't fail to notice. "Oh, good evening, young one." He stood up and watched as Midoriya did the same. "You had me worried there for a moment. I thought I might have to take you to the hospital." Hospital? "Oh no, I'm perfectly fine. And no need." He waved his arms back and forth, eyes still stuck on the notebook All Might was holding. He handed the notebook back. "I signed the front page, but I couldn't help but take a look. You have real talent, kid. Not every hero is able to do analysis in the first place, let alone anything as in-depth as this. Midoriya seemed slightly confused by this. It's just dumb notes. They're not really that good, just dumb hope. Toshinori frowned. Dumb hope? I wanted to be a hero. Wanted to. Past tense. Midoriya sighed and averted his gaze away from All Might. It was always this big dream of mine. I kinda wanted to be like an inexact replica of you. It's dumb, I'm sorry. You can still be a hero, young man. With skills like these, you do well. I don't have a quirk. Midoriya finally made eye contact with the pro hero. Do you really think that a quirkless kid could still be like you? Toshinori just stared at the young boy. He'd been told of his quirkless status. He'd been aware of that fact even after suggesting he be a hero. The thing was, under a normal circumstance, he would have agreed with Midoriya. Being quirkless would be an extreme weakness in many cases. Only being able to rely on physical strength was a lot. Sure, outsmarting your enemy is something he could probably do well, but without a quirk he wouldn't even make it into the hero course at UA. The entrance exam would be too difficult for him. But the situation wasn't normal. This kid would become a powerful villain unless they prevented that. He couldn't just speak his opinion, and he had to at least try to help the boy. If he didn't help, then what kind of hero would he be? He opened his mouth to speak, but then realized that he'd reached his limit. His body deflated into the skeletal form and he immediately began coughing up blood. Midoriya gaped, eyes wide, and his body was trembling. This was All Might's truth, the big secret that no one could know. Having Midoriya know this information was problematic. He'd had no choice though. He couldn't just leave the boy. Not after what Yaoyorozu told him. The life of a hero isn't as great as it looks. Most think it's all glory and fun, but it's much more complicated than that. Everyone sees me as this symbol of peace. As long as I'm here, then everyone feels safe. The thing is, I'm not always going to win the fights. Sometimes the villain is too strong, and I have to admit defeat. It's only come close to that one time. He sighed and pulled his shirt up to reveal the injury. This is a wound that a villain gave me 5 years ago. Midoriya stared at it. He cringed at the sight. It was a nasty scar. Toshinori could agree with that. It wasn't exactly healed either, which made it all the more painful. My respiratory system is in shambles, and my stomach was completely scooped out. I've been through dozens and dozens of surgeries and faced all of the complications. I've been reduced to a limit of 3 hours of hero work a day. Wait, Midoriya squinted his eyes. 5 years ago? Was that when you fought Toxic Chainsaw? All Might chuckled. The kid had definitely been a fanboy. He couldn't really say that the kid seemed excited to see him now though, but he still wore a smile. You know your stuff, but no, that guy could never do anything like that. He wasn't strong enough. The fight that gave me this was never made public. Midoriya nodded, though he still cupped his index finger and thumb onto his chin as if deep in thought about the matter. A symbol of peace who saves people with a smile. Things wouldn't end well if word had gotten out. I smile so that I can repress the feeling of overwhelming pressure and stress. Being a hero is a wonderful job, sure, but it's not an easy one. He looked over at Midoriya, tried to reason with himself over what to tell the kid. He had a feeling that in Yaoyorozu's timeline, All Might had a similar conversation with the boy. One where he didn't take a peek in the notebook nor know of what Midoriya was to be. Toshinori was certain that he'd likely crushed the dreams of the boy, which would have surely aided into his descent to evil. So everyone was right then? A quirkless kid can never become a hero. Midoriya frowned and turned around. Thank you, All Might. You helped me sort things out. I never said that. What? Toshinori watched as the boy turned back around. I never said that you couldn't be a hero. Yes, it'd be dangerous if you did. It'd take a hell of a lot of work, more so than any other kid aiming to be a hero too. But it's not impossible. Midoriya's eyes were wide, his mouth opened in awe. He'd truly given up on his own dream, but All Might's words paved a new path for him. Whatever he had just decided a moment ago was being reconsidered. He didn't expect to watch streams of tears silently fall down Midoriya's freckled cheeks. Toshinori was never one to be emotional, but he couldn't help but hurt for the boy. His own childhood was similar, born without a quirk of his own and forced to give up a dream of being a hero. But then his life changed, a quirk was given to him and his life started anew. Maybe Midoriya was a worthy successor, but he didn't want to risk anything yet. No, he wanted to be certain if this would be a good idea. It was a possibility, one that may spite his enemy as well. All Might would do whatever it takes to ensure the fall of All for One. Do you really think that? Midoriya was hesitant to even ask. He bit at his own cheek immediately after letting the question settle into the air. Of course. Here Toshinori gestured for Midoriya to hand him his notebook, which he did. He grabbed a pen from his own pocket and wrote down a set of numbers. I want you to stay in touch with me. Go ahead and message me now so that I can save your number when I return home. There's someone I want you to meet. Who? I'll explain everything soon, but I think that it's best that we both part ways and rest. Being attacked by a villain like that can cause a lot of trauma, so you should return home. Just remember, you can't tell anyone about what I've told you today. All right? Midoriya nodded, holding his notebook with a soft smile. The boy surely had a lot of emotional trauma to deal with, so much bad had happened in his life. But All Might could be patient if he needed to, and he knew that helping the boy was his best bet. Besides, the kid was actually nice to have around. They parted ways soon after, Toshinori switching back to his All Might form to safely get Midoriya to the ground. He then quickly made his way back to UA, where he could hide in Nedzu's office and return to his weakened form. All Might, how did patrolling go? I heard you captured the sludge villain. Nedzu smiled at him, but frowned when he watched Toshinori's face turn to a look of pure horror. He reached to his pockets and noted the absence of the bottle he'd put the villain into. Is everything all right? No, I forgot to make sure it was still there. The villain escaped. Oh my, that is indeed an issue. Nedzu watched as the hero bolted out of the room and began his search for the villain. Maybe you should go after him, Aizawa. I'm sure he's reached his limit by now. Aizawa sighed and stood up from his seat. This was about to be a long day. Izuku felt better, more so than he had earlier. A new hope burning bright in his eyes, but nothing had really changed. All Might may have shown hope for him, but that didn't change the fact that things were shitty. He still had other obstacles to deal with. And who knows, maybe All Might just didn't want to crush his dreams and so he lied. Izuku didn't think that was the case though. The pro hero seemed determined in helping him. Going home wasn't something Izuku wanted to do, but he knew there was nowhere else he could go. He tried procrastinating by walking through the city, even passing by UA and admiring the building. He watched as a man exited the gates. He was tall and his black hair was messy. There were bags under his eyes, and a long white scarf was hung around his neck. The man stared at Izuku for a moment, and the boy panicked and waved at him. The man looked away after that, though he was heading in the same direction as Izuku. He didn't look like a teenager, so he doubted the man was a student. The teacher, maybe? But even so, the teachers were all pro heroes. Izuku was certain that he'd recognize a pro hero. The guy did seem familiar though, so Izuku probably just didn't remember. Izuku sighed and stared at his phone, the message he'd sent to All Might staring back at him. It felt surreal, honestly. He never expected All Might of all people to believe in him. Felt like it could almost be enough to make Izuku believe he could amount to anything, but it wasn't enough. He still didn't feel as obsessed with his idol. He once would have asked the man a million questions and wouldn't let him leave. Now, the number one hero only reminded him of what he wanted to be. He couldn't actually be a hero like All Might. The man made that point pretty clear. Hero work isn't even easy for someone as seemingly strong as him, which meant that Izuku wouldn't make it very far. He only knew one thing. He didn't know what to do anymore. What to think even. Believe All Might and attempt a career in heroics? Listen to his peers and jump off the roof? Listen to his mother and find a different career path like being a police officer or even just a simple office job? It was all too confusing. He didn't like that. Izuku sighed as he continued his journey home. The man he'd seen leave UA was walking in front of him, going in the same direction that Izuku was going. The man also seemed to be looking around. His head kept turning left and right, but never backwards towards Izuku. He wondered if the man thought he was following him. Izuku just held his head low. He had to mind his own business. He held his notebook tightly to his chest. The thought of him meeting All Might always sounded like a dream. In all honesty, it was underwhelming. Maybe that was just due to the fact that Izuku now knew a classified secret that only a select few were aware of, But it could also be from the fact that Izuku didn't believe All Might. He wasn't sure why either, but the way All Might kept trying to figure out what to tell Izuku, trying to explain every reason why he couldn't be a hero, and then say he could. It just didn't make sense to him. He wanted to believe it, he wanted desperately to know that All Might didn't doubt that Izuku could be a hero. It would feel great to know that everyone had been wrong, everyone who tormented him for just having a dream. For his mom giving up on him. No, he couldn't blame her for that. He held his breath for a moment, watching as the man in front of him came to a halt. He turned around and stared at Izuku, tired eyes staring into the junior high student's eyes. Izuku didn't dare speak, just stood there uncomfortably as he waited for the man to speak. The man didn't end up saying anything, though he opened his mouth too, but then shook his head and turned back around and continued walking. Izuku was hesitant to follow after him, but he needed to get home. The air was tense after that. Izuku didn't like the feeling he was getting. Something didn't feel right about the situation, the way that the man looked at him. It was that moment when Izuku heard the commotion from nearby. He watched as the man ran towards the scene and Izuku followed after him. He stopped when he arrived at the crowd, and slowly he advanced towards an area where he could see what was happening. It wasn't exactly what he'd expected, even taking one look made him almost throw up. The sludge villain made his return, this time taking another kid hostage. It wasn't just any kid either, no, it was Kaken. Many pro heroes were gathered around the front of the crowd, some actively trying to fight the villain, but many only stayed as part of the crowd. Izuku's gaze stopped on the weakened form of All Might, possibly the only hero there who had any chance of beating him. Yet he just watched, he didn't even try. He let his limit get the best of him, he was willing to let Kaken die just to keep his pathetic secret. Sure, Kaken was a shitty person, but he didn't deserve to be suffocated to death and his body to be used as a puppet while everyone watched. Izuku clenched his fists, someone had to do something. Anyone. It just didn't seem like anyone thought they could, even the man who'd been walking in front of him was standing and talking with another hero. Maybe they were conjuring up a plan, maybe they were making funeral arrangements. Who knew? Because Izuku couldn't hear anything at that moment. The only noise he could register was the sound of Kaken yelling at the villain, and the villain only laughed. The villain quickly covered Kaken's mouth with his own, the sludge arms extending out in the air. Kaken tried to struggle, but his air was quickly decreasing. Izuku could remember that feeling vividly. He looked over at All Might once more, who noticed his gaze and stared at him before looking away. Was he ashamed? So ashamed that he was so powerless after trying to convince Izuku that he could be like All Might. If All Might was a coward who couldn't even save one kid, then Izuku didn't want to be like him. No, he wanted to be a real hero, one who saves people. Not All Might, who claimed to be so strong but really was so weak. Sure, it wasn't his fault. He was injured and physically couldn't power up, but even so, Izuku couldn't help but feel such hatred at seeing him just stand there. The man wasted all his energy trying to save Izuku, but he should have just let him die. Maybe then it'd be better. All Might was pathetic, just like Izuku. He didn't even notice when he began to move, his body leading them towards the villain as he heard gasps around him. He didn't look back to see the expressions of the heroes, he didn't even need to. His whole focus was on what he'd even do. He didn't even plan on trying to help, and yet his body decided to have a mind of its own. "Kid, you're gonna get yourself killed," a hero yelled, but Izuku ignored him and continued on. He arrived in front of the villain, throwing his bag at it and watching as the villain lost his grasp on Kaken's face. "What the hell are you doing, do you dash?" I don't know." Izuku frowned. Why was he saving Kaken? He had no reason to. The boy only tormented him his entire life. This could have been his chance to be free of all that, and yet, "I couldn't just sit there and watch you die." The sludge villain yelled and extended its arms to attack Izuku, trying to get him away so he could continue to acquire its vessel. Izuku then realized that he couldn't do anything to protect himself, he was powerless. He closed his eyes and braced himself for impact, but it never arrived. He opened his eyes slowly and stared at the two heroes in front of him, All Might and the man from before. All Might was able to power up, but who knew how long he'd be able to stay like that? "I told you, kid, you can be a hero." All Might smiled and punched the villain. The other hero used the scarf around his neck to restrain the arms of the sludge villain. Us pro heroes are always risking our lives. That's the true test of a hero. Izuku stared at him and watched him fight, the villain yelling at him right as All Might used a Detroit smash. Gusts of wind circled the area, and the villain quickly was defeated. Kaken frowned, a conflicted look set in his eyes as he stared between All Might and Izuku. He sat on the ground and was trembling, taking in as much air as he could. Why? Kaken muttered, his gaze settling on Izuku. I didn't need you to try and save me. Izuku bit at the inside of his cheek and sighed, looking away from his former friend. He tried to stand up, but the adrenaline was fading and he found his legs weak. The man he didn't know the name of helped him up, looking between Kaken and Izuku. Are you both all right? He asked, his voice flat and emotionless. He looked over at All Might and noticed the way he stared off at the ground. I'm fine. Kaken spat. Izuku only nodded. The man nudged at All Might, who snapped himself out of his daze. He immediately looked at Izuku and sighed. You did good, kid. If you hadn't done that, I don't think we would have gathered our strength to fight. He was wording it in a way that wouldn't let Kaken in on the big secret, but even with the context it sounded pathetic. I shouldn't have even had to do that. You wasted your strength on me and look where that almost got you. Izuku looked away. He was more mad than he'd expected himself to be. You all just stood there. You couldn't at least try? You had to wait until the quirkless kid actually tried to do something. All Might looked almost surprised, but he didn't say anything because that was when the other heroes and the ambulance arrived. Kaken was taken to the ambulance to ensure he wasn't going to face any health problems. You shouldn't have done that, kid. If All Might was even a moment late, you would have died. Izuku wasn't given any praise from the other heroes, instead scolded for his actions and told to never be so reckless ever again. Izuku was asked many questions regarding the incident, and he answered each. After all the commotion ended, he sat against a building with his knees curled to his chest. The man from earlier walked by and sat next to him, a coffee in his hand. He slowly took a sip, then sighed, My name is Aizawa. You're Izuku Midoriya, right? Izuku nodded. Aizawa frowned and took another sip of coffee. I hate the media. Izuku chuckled, Yeah, I think I do too. Aizawa looked at him, took a lot of work to get them to not bother you. Figured you didn't need them asking you so many questions after everything that happened. Oh, thanks. Izuku decided that Aizawa was a strange man, but something about him just felt warm. His voice held no emotion, yet his words still felt kind. He wasn't trying to bother Izuku about why he should or shouldn't have done what he did, he just talked to him like a person. Are you an underground hero then? He set the cup of coffee on the ground next to him. It must have been empty already. I prefer it that way. Less chance of villains knowing how to fight against my quirk. What is your quirk? Aizawa hesitated for a moment, but then sighed. Erasure. I can erase someone's quirk temporarily. Now that was actually kind of cool, whoa. That sounds super handy. But can you erase mutant-type quirks? No, which makes it hard fighting villains like that sludge one. He sighed, I also can't depend on it too much. So you have to find other ways of fighting too, huh? Like quirkless fighting styles. Aizawa's eyes softened for a moment, something Izuku didn't fail to notice. He must have been aware of Izuku's quirkless status. Then he remembered that he mentioned it himself when yelling at All Might. Every hero needs to know quirkless fighting styles. Relying on quirks can only get you killed. If there was a villain with my power, then they'd have to have other means of fighting against that villain. Izuku couldn't help but smile at that. He couldn't imagine Kaken trying to fight without his quirk. They sat in silence for a few more moments, watching as All Might spoke with one of the detectives. Aizawa sighed, You seem mad at All Might. Izuku widened his eyes and hugged his knees tightly. No, I mean I don't know. I just hate this society, how much we all rely on quirks. All those heroes watched a few fail at fighting the villain and just gave up. They were willing to let Kaken die rather than attempting to fight. Aizawa didn't say anything for a moment, then leaned his head against the wall. Things aren't always perfect. Many heroes have quirks that make them believe that quirks are the only aspect of fighting. This society raises us all to care so much about quirks that we tend to ignore the quirkless aspects. You've been given the gift of being able to see these flaws, But without a quirk you're at a serious disadvantage in life. I always try and get my students to see through the flaws, but many are convinced that they are better than anyone else because they made it into the hero program. They think they can fight every battle and win, but once they have to fight a real villain, then things won't be so simple. Izuku frowned. Being quirkless wasn't a gift to help him see the flaws of society. Being quirkless was a weakness that made him a social reject. It made him see the flaws and be powerless to fix it. Izuku, where have you been? Denki asked as Izuku walked into the house. He ignored the blonde and grabbed the TV remote and changed the channel to the news station. They were still talking about the sludge villain incident. He stared at the screen. Footage of the sludge villain trying to take control of Kaken's body was shown, even footage of Izuku running to help. Someone had probably filmed the situation on their phone and offered it to the news station. They even had an interview with All Might, though it was very brief given the fact that All Might was at his limit. Whoa, wait, Denki sat up and stared at the screen. Did that just happen? Izuku nodded, frowning as the others gathered around the TV. You tried to help him? After the way he treats you? Shinso asked, looking at Izuku with tired eyes. He reminded Izuku of Aizawa. I guess. Izuku mumbled, not making eye contact with anyone. He wasn't going to trust them anymore, not after what he heard. They didn't know he knew their secret, and he wasn't planning on making them aware. I'm going to bed. When my mom gets home, don't let her see that. Uraraka furrowed her brows, but nodded nonetheless. Izuku walked off to his room, closing the door behind him and letting himself fall on top of his bed. He grabbed a pillow and hugged it tightly, letting tears cascade down onto the fabric as he let out all the pent-up emotions. He was so angry he couldn't stop thinking about everything that happened that day. First his classmates vandalized his desk and told him to kill himself, then Kaken tells him that he should give up on his dream, then he found out that his new friends are actually time travelers trying to stop him from being a villain, then he was attacked by a villain and saved by All Might, which then results in All Might telling him he can be a hero even after stating every reason why Izuku shouldn't. To make things worse, the villain somehow escaped from All Might and almost killed Kaken, and Izuku had to step up because no one else would, then yelled at him for it. So yeah, he was upset. It was a long fucking day, and he couldn't handle all that stress. Part of him wondered if it were a sign that he should just stop and give up. Maybe it was only the beginning of his misfortunes. He didn't want to know what was next. 2 knocks could be heard from the door. Izuku quickly wiped his tears away and stood up, walking to the door and hesitating before opening it. Todoroki stood at the doorway with a concerned look on his face. I left my phone in here. Are you all right? Izuku let Todoroki in and closed the door once more. Where'd you put it? Oh, it's on the desk over there. Izuku looked at his desk and tried to ignore the hero analysis notebook that sat next to the phone. He hadn't left that out. It was the first one. They must have looked through them. Why is it locked? Izuku handed the phone to Todoroki after noticing the lock screen that said he couldn't unlock it for another 6 hours. Todoroki paused, rubbing the back of his neck as he shoved the phone in his pocket. I can't remember my passcode. Izuku raised a brow. He almost wanted to laugh. He wondered how far in the future he's from, how long it has been since he had actually been 14. You forgot your own passcode? Todoroki nodded. He didn't seem too ashamed to admit it. He'd probably accepted that it would be an issue anyways. My father marked me as missing and I'm trying to contact him. I don't know his phone number and I can't get into my phone. I'm pretty sure I'm just going to have to return home for a day. You didn't tell him of this field trip? Todoroki chuckled. He wouldn't have let me go anyways. He only wants me to train. I snuck here so that I didn't have to get permission, but I think I need to smooth it over with him before he goes crazy. Izuku nodded, sitting down on his bed. You're definitely in a bit of a predicament. He nodded. Yes, but it seems you are too. Were you crying because of that villain? Izuku frowned. Not really. Do you want to talk about it? No. Okay. Todoroki began walking to the door, then paused as his hand landed on the doorknob. He turned around. Would you like to go with me to let my father know I'm alive? Izuku blinked. Why would I? It might distract you from all the stress you're going through. I'm sure you'd like to get away from the others. They've been very clingy. Izuku let out a small laugh. Yeah, they kind of have been. I don't really understand why they are. I can't figure it out. It was a lie, sure, but he had to see the reaction that Todoroki gave him. He wanted to know what he'd say. I think it's because we care about you, we want to help you. Right? You want to make yourselves feel better by trying to make the life of a quirkless kid less shitty. Truth is, you can't help. You can't make everything go away. Izuku stood up from his bed and stretched his arms. The damage is done. Todoroki frowned. Are you angry with us? Izuku didn't respond. He only smiled and put his hero notebook back on the shelf, glancing over at Todoroki so that the boy knew he was aware that they went through his books while he was gone. I'll be leaving first thing in the morning, if you care to join me. Todoroki turned back around and left. Izuku smiled wider. He felt a bit better, watching the way Todoroki became uncomfortable with Izuku's words. The confusion in his face, it was almost funny. This is all so fucked up, he sighed. Part of him wished he were back in the moment of All Might telling him he could be a hero, the happiness he'd felt. The blind ignorance that he allowed himself to feel because he'd waited his whole life to hear those words. He didn't know if he really wanted to be a hero anymore after the events of the entire day, but he knew he didn't want to be a villain either. He wanted to fix society, but he couldn't do so on his own. He was powerless, literally and figuratively, so he'd only be frowned upon for pointing out the ugly nature of those who have quirks. Shunned by society once more. He remembered Aizawa, who seemed to be the first person to actually understand that side of society that Izuku saw every day. He took out his phone and looked up the man, finding an article on him. He was an underground hero called Eraserhead, a name that Izuku doubted he'd come up with himself. It just didn't seem like the kind of name he'd want. He looked like the guy that'd just choose a random noun or even go with his regular name. There wasn't much to find. It seemed like the man preferred to avoid the media whenever possible. Izuku grabbed his 13th notebook and opened to a blank page, beginning to fill out his notes on the hero and drawing him using an image he found online. Doing his analysis notes always calmed his mind and brought him back to reality, though he couldn't help the mumbling that he let out as he wrote out the notes. He stared out the window for a moment, his eyes stopping on a distant figure. They stood there, though Izuku couldn't tell who it was, they were too far away. He sighed and closed his curtains. So, Endeavor? Izuku didn't really know what to say. He'd never had any opinions on the number 2 hero. Sure, he'd vaguely followed along on what villains he'd defeated, but never as obsessively as he had with All Might. How's it like being his son? Shoto shrugged, leading the way through the neighborhood. It's alright, I suppose. Alright? Izuku chuckled. It's gotta suck. All that publicity? The pressure to be as strong as him and live up to his legacy? I don't think I'd be able to handle any of it. Shoto looked over at him and furrowed his brows. Izuku could only imagine what was going on in his head. He definitely seemed quite nervous, if the constant fidgeting was any indicator. How far in the future was he from? 5 years? It was something Izuku would have to remain clueless on, unless he just so happened to be able to overhear them again. He doubted it, and so he was fine living in his partial ignorance. Speaking of fathers, Shoto paused, probably considering the best way to phrase his question. Izuku already knew what he'd ask, but he wasn't sure he wanted to answer it. Is your father really overseas? Izuku almost laughed. Shoto was a curious guy. He didn't think it was a bad thing. He himself was a rather curious guy too. He just wasn't as pushy to know about the personal lives of others. If someone didn't want to say anything, then that was to be respected. Where else would he be? Izuku spoke, continuing the walk to the Todoroki household. It's not like he's just hiding in the apartment next door. He's been gone my whole life. Shoto seemed to decide that it was a sensitive subject and moved on. When we get to my house, don't follow me inside until I tell you to. Why is that? My father will be enraged at me. I'd rather let him blow off some steam and then let him know I brought company. Izuku raised a brow, suddenly curious as to the seemingly sensitive temper of the number 2 hero. It would make sense if he were on the angry side. He was literally hot-headed. So, you just want me to wait at the door? Izuku asked, double-checking with Shoto. He nodded, which made Izuku nod back. Wait at the door, how fun. So essentially, I'm here to make sure he doesn't hurt you? If there was one thing Izuku knew, it was that if someone hurts you, you won't forget. Izuku spent his life being hurt by others. His constant anxiety and low self-worth was a result of that. Todoroki seemed to hold his head high at first, but Izuku could tell he wasn't all that great with adults. His hands seemed to shake, as if worried for whatever was to happen. Shoto froze and stared at Izuku, then focused his gaze back on the house they were almost arriving at. No, it's not like that. He's my father dash. Oh, 'cause fathers don't hurt their kids? Wouldn't that be a nice world to live in? Izuku sighed. It was an interesting discovery, to say the least. All he knew was that it made him even more infuriated with heroes than before. All Might probably couldn't do worse than abuse his son, possibly even his whole family. Shoto, do you even want to be a hero? He seemed almost baffled by the question, as if it were so confusing and daring to say. It was silent for a moment, but then Shoto sighed and began to speak once more. Of course I want to be a hero. Izuku waited for him to say anything else, to see if he was truly conflicted. It didn't seem to be the case. I don't understand you. Don't you want to be a hero too? Another pause. I guess. It's complicated right now, okay? Izuku sighed and watched as they finally arrived at the Todoroki house. He sat down and leaned back against the house, watching as Shoto placed a hand on the doorknob. Complicated? Izuku chuckled. You ask a lot of questions. Don't you also get curious? There was the whole curiosity thing again. Izuku just frowned. Always wanting to know the answers to everything? Yeah, but there's a difference between asking and prying. Izuku didn't like seeming rude. He never liked making people feel any negative emotions. In some situations, though, he just needed to speak his true feelings and be blunt. Besides, why worry about me when you're the one too scared to face your own father? Shoto let his hand fall from the doorknob. He stared at the chipped paint that sat at the edge of the wooden door and didn't say a word. His eyes occasionally glanced over at Izuku, but quickly looked away. I'm tired of all the lies. I appreciate you guys trying to help and get the kids in my class to stop being mean to me, but are you doing it for me? Or are you doing it for yourselves? Silence once more, but this time Shoto decided to stare at Izuku. He was becoming suspicious of Izuku, of what information he knew. It was becoming obvious, that was for sure. The door opened before either of them could do anything. A girl stood there with furrowed brows. Shoto? She slowly stepped forward, then grabbed Shoto and embraced him in a hug. He stood there and didn't move, his arms glued to his sides. Where have you been? This was the part where she looked up and noticed Izuku, who only stood there in curiosity. She looked too young to be Shoto's mother, and the red streaks in her hair were definitely from Endeavor's genetics. Shoto's older sister, probably. She stood and looked between the two teenage boys and awaited a response to her initial question before she even bothered to ask the second one. A field trip for school. He and his friends were on the other side of Mizutafu to do notes on UA and the debut of new heroes. Izuku looked over at Shoto to see his reaction. It was void of any emotion, to his dismay. Friends? She glanced over at Shoto and smiled. You must be one of his friends, then? Izuku nodded and smiled. Is Endeavor home? Yeah, where is he? I came back home to inform him of where I went. I lost my phone and haven't been able to get in touch. Shoto spoke. Is Natsuo home? No, I don't think he will be until he finishes this semester of college. The girl sighed. Izuku had yet to learn her name and really didn't find the importance of asking. Father is, well, he's out at his agency. Izuku felt the hairs on his neck prickle up. He turned around to see the cause. He felt like he was being watched, but he didn't see anyone in sight. Maybe it was the figure he'd seen the night before. It sounded like the most likely scenario. It wouldn't surprise him anymore if someone decided to spy on him. It felt like a new normal now. Well, maybe we should get going then. Don't wanna dash, Izuku began, but Shoto's sister interrupted. No please, at least let me make you two some lunch. Fuyumi, it's alright dash. I insist. She widened the door and gestured for them to enter. Izuku glanced at Shoto and shrugged, following her inside the house. Shoto followed behind him, though he was much more apprehensive. The house was rather neat. It looked like someone took great care into keeping it clean and orderly. Izuku noticed the lack of pictures on the walls, the lack of any personality. It was a traditional Japanese home. It was large and showed off the wealth of the Todoroki family. It was like a castle compared to Midoriya's humble apartment. Whoa, Izuku mumbled under his breath. He gazed around and was tempted to brush his fingers against the wall as he walked by, but he felt like if he even touched it, it'd be ruined. It's beautiful. Izuku noticed Shoto smile, but looked away quickly after realizing Izuku noticed. He shoved his hand into the pocket of his hoodie and sighed. It's all just a facade. Izuku raised a brow, then looked at Fuyumi who had stopped walking and didn't turn around to face them. Shoto dashed. It's true, isn't it? Shoto stared at his right arm and clenched his fist. My friend's name is Midoriya, he's quirkless. I always thought that it'd be better to be quirkless than to have to be the son of Endeavor. I'm learning that this society is the problem, not just father. It doesn't matter if you have a quirk or not, life in a hero society is unfair. Fuyumi turned around. Midoriya, do you like soba? Izuku nodded. I'll let you both know when food is ready. And so, she left. Izuku assumed she went to the kitchen. He looked over at Shoto and frowned. Being a hero, that's your dream? Shoto nodded. Be a good one, not like the other heroes that this society created. He trudged through the streets, unaware of where he even was. Something wasn't right, he could tell. He'd always known he'd have to do this, but actually being back to when he was a kid? It wasn't right. He'd been following Izuku at first, trying to see the way he acted. He didn't want the others to know he was there. They probably thought he was dead for all he knew. He didn't want to scare them, or make them think that it wasn't actually him. They'd probably assume that he was Himiko Toga, because she had taken the blood of several of their classmates. They were safe from her at this time though. Eri wouldn't have let Toga trick her. He sighed, turning around from the Todoroki house and walking back to Mizudafu. He'd been following Izuku in hopes of gaining the courage to talk to him, but watching him interact with the others felt so strange. He couldn't wrap his head around how odd the situation was. Being in his younger body didn't help either. He felt so weak and puny. So small compared to how he usually was. Even walking as far as he had was starting to get exhausting, so he knew he had to give up on confronting Izuku until after he made his friends aware of his presence in the timeline. It took only 10 minutes to return to Izuku's apartment. Luckily Todoroki lived in Mizudafu as well. On the other side of town though, which wasn't as convenient. He stood at the door, hearing the soft mumbles from the other side. He sighed and raised his fist, creating 2 knocks on the wood of the door. The mumbling from the other side halted. He heard the sound of footsteps slowly approach the door. Hello Dash. The door opened and Kirishima stood there. Oh, what's up Bakugu? Bakugu smiled warmly. Hey shitty hair. Kirishima raised a brow. Bakugu? We all need to talk. He didn't wait for an invitation to enter the apartment. It wasn't even theirs to begin with. Besides, Inko was rather fond of him in the future. Bakugu? He heard Uraraka mumble. He looked over at the others. They all sat around the TV eating from a bowl of popcorn. Slackers, he rolled his eyes. He then turned towards Kirishima and frowned. Guessing you haven't been able to do jack shit, eh? Kirishima widened his eyes. Wait a minute Katsuki? Hearing his first name be spoken made him smile again. He nodded. I figured I'd help out. So you woke up? Denki asked. The others seemed almost confused as well. Of course I woke up. He growled. I'm the #1 hero, damn it. It was silent for a moment, an uncomfortable moment of time in which he knew what they were all thinking. He didn't bother waiting for them to confront him. He had to be the one to say it. I've never been proud of my past. I never claimed to be. He sat down. When I first got my quirk, everyone acted like I was so amazing that I'd be the strongest hero ever. That included Izuku. We were really close friends before. I let the power get to my head, constantly got angry and felt as though everyone were doubting me. Deku never got his quirk. He was weak and helpless and I couldn't help but feel like I was the weak one. I took out my anger on him, because he kept wanting to be a hero and he wouldn't stop. They didn't say anything. He wasn't sure if he was glad or not. They were listening though, which was better than nothing. Here's the thing, in the original timeline he jumped off the roof on the day of the sludge villain incident. I had told him that the only way for him to be a hero was if he jumped off the roof and hoped for a quirk in his next life. I don't even know why I said it. I went too far. And I guess that day All Might had told him he couldn't be a hero without a quirk, and he just snapped. Everyone thought he was dead, But then when I was at UA and the villains attacked the USJ, he was there. He was a villain. Did you tell him to jump in this timeline? Mina began, eyes wide in horror. I don't think so. I can't remember much of what this version of me did, but I don't recall any memories of it. He closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. I wanted to confront him before telling you guys that I'm here, but he's with Todoroki right now and it'd be odd if I just followed him there. Yeah, very. Shinso sighed. Is there anything else we should know about the original timeline? You should know that you guys were in the original timeline, too. He watched as they stared at him, eyes wide and confusion filling each expression. In the original timeline, I remember you guys trying to fix it still. You all pestered me about being a better person and helping me. That's why I hated you all at first when we started you. None of you even remembered me. I always thought you were lying, but it makes more sense now. Wait, so we've tried to fix the timeline before and we failed? Kirishima frowned. I mean, maybe this time we did better. He didn't jump off the building yesterday and dash. Yeah, but that doesn't mean we're in the clear. You all are still fucking everything up. He was pissed, rightfully so. They were being so reckless while messing with time. They kept messing up and driving Izuku deeper down into the conflict of if he wanted to be a hero. The plan was just destined to fail. You're invading his house, going through his books, asking personal questions and shoving yourselves into his life, and you're not even trying to hide why you're here. You have to think about this from his perspective. This Izuku isn't the same one you remember. He's not a strong villain yet, and we need to make sure he doesn't become one. Katsuki wasn't mad at them, though he was acting like he was. He was mad at himself. It was all his fault. He told Izuku to jump, so he jumped. He caused so much trauma for Izuku, and yet as a villain he still spared Katsuki's life. He held a lot of regret with his former friend. He should have been the only one to travel back in time. He knew what to do, the others didn't. Alright, how do we fix this then? Momo asked. She wasn't angry at the slightest. She was determined. She wanted to fix the future and she knew there was no time to argue or play the blame game. First of all, we need to find a place for each of you to stay. Give him space. Katsuki didn't really want to offer up his own home, but his house was definitely bigger than the tiny Midoriya apartment. They could all stay in the guest bedroom instead of sleep on the couches and floors. Then we stop involving All Might. No matter what he does, Izuku isn't going to listen. He knows about All Might's weakened form. That information plus what happened with the sludge villain, it's what makes him start to change his opinions on heroes. There were many occasions in the original timeline where Katsuki would find himself talking with All Might about Izuku. He was one of the only people who understood Katsuki's feelings, understood what it felt to regret something so deeply. They both failed Izuku that day, and often found themselves trying to figure out where everything went wrong. All Might told him every detail of what went down on the roof, what he'd said. The context of what Katsuki said only made All Might's actions worse. He left the kid on a fucking roof. What more was there to say? Wait, you said he jumped off a roof and everyone thought he was dead? Mina stared at the ground, brows furrowed as she sat deep in thought. Katsuki nodded. Did they just accept the fact that there was no body? There was a body. At least that's what Inko said. She had to identify it. It was a closed casket funeral, so no one ever really got a good look. He bit the inside of his cheek. I'm guessing that whoever recruited him created a decoy body to fake his death. Though the blood was real, they were able to get him medical help and save him. Something like that. It was planned to go that way. I wouldn't doubt that he's being targeted by the villains even now. But why would the League of Villains be targeting a random quirkless boy? Uraraka asked. I don't think it's random. Denki frowned. If in our timeline, Katsuki still saw us interfering, that might mean that we weren't the only ones. What if someone from the League went back to dash? 3 knocks could be heard from the door. They each turned to face the door and silently argued over who would go answer it. Katsuki groaned and stood up after the silence lasted too long. He opened the door and frowned. Mineta? He mumbled, staring at the short boy in front of him. Oh, hey Bakugu. What you doing here? He didn't seem to realize that Bakugu was the one from the original timeline. Breathe. 1, 2, 3. Who the hell was that? What? Uraraka furrowed her brows. She stared over at Katsuki with confusion laced in her expression. Each of them did. Each time traveler raised their eyes to stare at him. The room felt smaller than ever. The sound of each person breathing was almost loud enough to drive Katsuki insane. He breathed in, then exhaled and contained his anger. He'd have to thank Aizawa for getting him into anger management. It surely helped. It would just have to be this timeline's Aizawa. That can't be Mineta. He frowned, rubbing the bottom of his chin with his thumb and pointer finger. Before I time traveled, he was just coming back from a mission where he was severely injured. Apparently, he was searching for food when villains attacked him. But couldn't he have possibly come from a different point in time? Like after he recovered? Denki suggested, trying to stay hopeful that the Mineta they'd been sharing information with wasn't a fake. Let me put this into perspective for you. If for some reason they needed to send another person back to help, why would they choose Mineta? Katsuki sighed. When they sent me back, it was only because I knew more about Deku than any of you ever could. I told them not to send in anyone else. I knew it'd be too risky. If I'd been awake when this plan was created, I would have lowered the number to 4 people at most. And why should we trust your judgment? The room went silent as each set of eyes all turned and stared at Shinso, who only stared at Katsuki with dead eyes. Shinso had always been different from the rest of their class. He wasn't added into the hero course until the end of their first year, and he'd always avoid making friends with them. It didn't take long for them to break his walls down and let him share the circumstances of his childhood, the way his quirk was demonized. He could relate to Izuku more than anyone, and he probably felt a sense of responsibility to stick up for the boy. It didn't matter who Izuku was to become, because Shinso was always aware that he could have ended up the same way. That being said, he wasn't easy to forgive someone. Now that he knew Katsuki's past, it didn't seem like he'd let him off the hook so easy. What? You bullied a kid for being quirkless, Bakugu. Why should we blindly believe everything you say when you've created a villain yourself? You bullied a kid to suicide. Katsuki frowned. He was well aware of this fact. Though Deku didn't end up being dead, he would have if not for the League. It was the big thing that made Katsuki understand that he couldn't just say whatever he wanted to people, he couldn't lash out or be unnecessarily cruel. Even so, hearing one of his friends, albeit a much younger version, say this to him? It hurt more than he expected. Fine. What do you suggest we do? We help him. Like decent people? We get him to be a hero like he always wanted to be. That's not gonna work, Katsuki groaned. It's too late already. And how would you know that? Yururika chimed in, her hopeful nature showing itself. Her optimism was noble, but it was too late for a mindset like that. Just look at him, he's had his meeting with All Might already, and I just know the old wench didn't say the right thing. In the original timeline, Deku was supposedly dead already, so he didn't entirely fail, but the look in his eyes after the sludge villain incident dash. So you're basing this off of the look in his eyes, is that right? Shinso asked. You don't know Deku like I do. He always was one to hide what he really felt and be reckless. If he was upset, then he wouldn't try to show it unless it bothered him too much. He stood up and looked out the window of the apartment. Mineta was long gone and there was no sign of Deku yet. Let's return to the main subject of concern. We need to figure out if that's the real Mineta or not. Katsuki remained by the window, eyes staring for any sign of someone returning to the apartment. Let's look at our options. 1. He's the real one. 2. He's Toga. 3. A different villain is disguised as him. 4. It's him but he could possibly be under the influence of a quirk. And what if it's none of them? Kirishima asked, breaking his long silence. Well, it shouldn't be too big of a deal. When he comes back, we can just get the truth out of him. Katsuki finally turned and stared at Shinso. Isn't that right? Shinso sighed and nodded, understanding what he was asking. Using his quirk wouldn't be terrible, he supposed. There's something else I should mention. Katsuki looked back out the window. Deku's father isn't overseas. What are you saying? It was something they all suspected. The topic of fathers was so odd with Izuku. But still, they had to be curious as to the truth. His father is a villain too. In the last timeline, after Izuku died, I tried going over to see Inko, but his father was there. I heard them argue, and she mentioned him being a villain. Is he a well-known villain? I'm not sure. Never got to see him. I'm not even fully sure if he was physically at Inko's apartment or not. His voice sounded muffled. The sound of vicious scratching filled the room. Each person there only sat and pretended not to notice. The bartender cleaned the inside of a cup as he watched the guy at the counter continue to itch at his neck. Is something the matter? The man shot him an irritated look, his eyes wide and his mouth twitched at every movement. His red eyes darted around the room. I just don't understand why all this is necessary. It's just one kid, what's so special about him? His voice was as dry as his face. The feeling it gave was similar to nails on a chalkboard. He might be just one kid now, but he's destined to be all for one successor. He's our best shot at getting what we want, the man in the corner of the room spoke, his own appearance not so perfect. Purple burn scars covered his body, scars from his own quirk. The man grinned with malice creeping on his expression. I've told you everything, it's your turn to decide what your course of action is. Shigaraki scowled, my turn? I shouldn't have to be the one to decide. Master Dash. Tamura, you should listen to him. He's here to help us achieve our goals. That's right, I was a great ally to you in the previous few timelines. I'm sure I can continue to help. It was silent for a moment. You say there were 4 timelines before this one, yes? Danny nodded. In the first one, Izuku Midoriya becomes Japan's greatest hero, defeating you after you were to inherit all for one. We were the ones to go back in time and try to undo it all, which created the second timeline. In that one, we were able to achieve greatness and cause Midoriya to become the strongest villain Japan has ever seen, but the heroes had to create a third timeline and try to prevent him from becoming a villain. We were able to figure this out and go back as well, preventing them from success. This timeline was made after that, another effort in which they try to undo what we've achieved. You're forgetting the 5th timeline. All for One spoke through the TV. 5th. Shigaraki glanced at the screen. A 5th timeline? Ugh, let's start from the beginning. In the first timeline, Izuku is chosen to inherit One for All. He's groomed into being the perfect hero and ends up defeating All for One. Dabi looked over at the TV. In a final effort to win, All for One used a quirk he'd been saving up and sent me and one other ally back in time. This created the second timeline, one in which we are able to turn Izuku into a villain and cause chaos. Dabi paused for a moment, making sure that Shigaraki was still listening. And so, the heroes found means of time travel and created the third timeline. In that timeline, they tried preventing Izuku from being a villain, and we were able to catch on and go back in time once more. We didn't end up having to do much. Izuku committed suicide and we weren't there to stop it. He was their only chance of defeating All for One, so world destruction happened and we didn't have to interfere much. This was the timeline I forgot to mention. So why don't we just let the kid die? Because we need to end the loop of time travel and kill the heroes who have been doing the time travel. Ugh, Shigaraki rolled his eyes. The next timeline was created by the heroes once again. This time they had no idea of 10 importance of Izuku. Bakugo just wanted to save his childhood friend from suicide, and then it became obvious of his importance. In that timeline, they were trying to both keep him alive and prevent him from villainy. They failed both. He jumped off of a roof and Kurogiri saved him and took him to the League, where yet again he caused world destruction. Then there's this timeline, one in which the heroes are yet again not learning from their mistakes. It seems that their method of time travel isn't allowing them to remember after a certain amount of time. Right, so we just have to save the kid from killing himself and then make him be All for One's successor? It's the only chance we have a victory. Thing is, the kid didn't try to jump in this timeline. The heroes are changing everything, they're being reckless. We need to watch Izuku Midoriya and find the best chance at recruiting him. Shigaraki sighed and rubbed his temples. Why did it have to be time travel? Why couldn't we solve our problems without having to try again? Sorry, Mineta, but Koga didn't know you were with us. Uraraka chuckled. He doesn't know we're from the future, so he's kind of lost on who we all are. Mineta nodded. That makes sense. I figured something was wrong, so I waited outside. You'll never guess who I saw. Who? Midnight. Crazy, right? Uraraka sighed. Right, she would be in the area because of working at UA and all. Oh, looks like we're here. They stood in front of the door to Izuku's apartment. Uraraka knocked 4 times. The door opened almost immediately, Momo standing at the door with a warm smile. They entered, the room full of the future heroes, but Bakugu sat at the end of one of the couches. Mineta raised a brow. We want you to meet him. We so far have been able to get him to stop being so mean to Izuku. Oh, that's great. Here, why don't you sit down over there? She pointed to the couch that Shinso was on, the spot next to him being the only open one. Mineta nodded and sat down. He said a quiet hello to Shinso. Hey, Momo was going to make some tea for everyone. Did you want any? Shinso asked, not really seeming focused on Mineta. Oh, I'm not really a tea kind of guy. You know, not a very manly thing to like. Mineta chuckled. Oh, all right. Shinso grinned. I need you to tell me the truth. Mineta was frozen in place, eyes wide as he slowly realized what happened. His free will was temporarily lost. Who are you really, because you aren't the real Mineta? Mineta opened his mouth. Himiko Toga, a member of the League of Villains. How did you get Mineta's blood? I just lured him. Seeing how perverted he is at this age, it was easy. He was eager to follow a random female to an empty alleyway. Shinso sighed. Go back to your regular form. Toga grinned, the form of Mineta slowly melting into gray goop as Toga's appearance tore through. Still stuck under Shinso's control, she only sat there. Mineta's clothes were far too small on her, leaving much of her skin exposed. Uraraka covered her body with a blanket. Tell us then, what do you know about the time travel? We've time traveled many times, you only won in the first timeline. The other 3 are all victories for us, and this timeline is yet to be determined. It's a game really, you all make the same mistakes over and forget each timeline, while we retain everything we know and keep succeeding. Katsuki stood up, a scowl indented on his face. Ask her why we kept losing. Why did we lose 3 times? Because, you let Izuku become a villain. You didn't save him, in one you let him kill himself. Toga's eyes were void, staring at nothing while not blinking even once. Wait, if he was dead in one of the ones we lost, then how did we even lose? Shinso frowned. There's only one way for you to win. The original timeline is one in which Izuku is Japan's greatest hero. He's the only one able to beat All for One. If he becomes All for One, then there's no one to stop him. If he dies, then no one can beat the next All for One. Katsuki groaned, exchanging a glance with Kirishima. But if we do win, you all will go back in time again? Shinso asked. Correct, that's how this all started. Then how do we win for good? You have 2 ways, you either kill All for One so we can't use his time travel quirk, or you convince Izuku to join your side after he obtains All for One. Katsuki looked over at Shinso, who nodded. What do we do about her? Mina asked. She sat next to Denki on the floor by the TV. I can't keep her under this trance forever, even getting her to talk has been highly draining. At this age, my quirk wasn't able to get people to do anything like this, so you can imagine that I'm at my limit. Right, let's tie her up then. We can hide her in the guest bedroom and have Momo make quirk-proof restraints. Uraraka looked over at Momo. Think you can do it? Momo nodded, walking to the kitchen and quickly grabbing something to eat. I just need to eat first, then I should be able to make them. They nodded. They all split up into smaller groups, either talking or trying to help Momo and Shinso with Toga. Kirishima found himself next to Bakugu. He placed a hand on his shoulder. It'll be alright, yeah? We have 2 ways to win. Get it all over and done with. And plus, we have one of the villains captured already. Kirishima smiled. We just need to save Izuku. Save him from what? We've already fucked everything up with him. He won't trust us at all. Hey, don't think like that. It isn't too late, it'll never be too late. He didn't try to jump, so we already made a difference. You're too optimistic. Katsuki frowned, staring at Shinso, who glanced at him for a moment before focusing back on Toga. I know. Hey, Katsuki, I wanted to ask something. Denki walked over to them. Toga got the blood from this timeline's Mineta, shouldn't we go make sure he's okay? Mineta, that was another thing. As a kid, Mineta was extremely perverted, so trying to make sure he was okay wasn't exactly thrilling. Katsuki much preferred the pro-hero Mineta, who actually could make himself useful and stop being a perv. You can go if you really feel like it. Chances are that he's fine and we'll be seeing him at the entrance exams. Denki nodded. Yeah, I guess you're right. What'll we do when Shoto and Izuku get back though? We have a villain tied up in the guest room, not exactly easy to hide. But Izuku and Shoto were still not back yet. They'd have to fill Shoto in on what had happened, then hope that he was able to distract Izuku enough. Katsuki sighed. He was tired. So, Fumi was nice. Izuku didn't really know what to say, if he were being honest. They'd been walking in silence for a while, and while he liked the silence, he knew they had to at least talk about something. Yeah, she's always been very nice. Shoto didn't really look over at Izuku, only staring at the ground in front of him. At least she'll tell my father that I'm not dead so he can stop acting like I'm missing. That won't stop him from trying to find you, right? And he can try all he wants. I'm not going to train with him anymore. Izuku frowned. Why not? Shoto didn't say anything else, only sighing as they found their way to the Midoriya apartment. Izuku grabbed the key from his pocket and unlocked the door, entering slowly as he realized the emptiness of the main room. That's odd, Shoto commented as he walked through the apartment. None of them were in sight, their belongings gone. Why would they just leave? Maybe they left a note or something? Izuku headed to the kitchen, gazing at the countertops and fridge for any scrap of paper that may have been left behind. There was nothing, and so he headed for his room. There was nothing out of the ordinary there either. Everything was in its correct place. He left his room and entered the guest room. The bags that were once placed atop the dresser were gone, and the bed was made. A small scrap of paper was placed randomly in the middle of the floor. Is that the note they left? Shoto asked as he followed in behind Izuku. He shook his head. Doesn't look like it. It's just an address. I don't think they meant to drop this. Shoto frowned, staring at the address. It was familiar, but he wasn't sure why. Maybe something from the past, but he'd know if it was important. Maybe they want us to meet them there? Izuku shrugged. I guess so. They quickly put their shoes back on and left the apartment once more. Todoroki held the paper and gave directions while Izuku led the way, looking around at each person he passed to see if there were any sign of the others. It didn't take long for them to stumble across the destination, a run-down building that seemed like it wasn't in actual use. A bar? Izuku frowned. It doesn't look like anyone is here either. Todoroki frowned, grabbing Izuku's hand and pulling him away. He began to recognize the place. Memories of battles fought long ago popped back up into his mind. No, it's not safe here. We have to go. Izuku raised a brow, not letting himself get dragged away. He stared at Shoto with a frown and turned back around to stare at the building. What? Do you recognize it? Yeah, it's the meeting place of the League. We can't dash. Shoto didn't get to finish his sentence. Instead he was met with a field of blue fire that divided both him and Izuku. He looked around each corner, each spot that he could be hiding. Eventually he spotted the mass of black hair and scarred skin from the crevices of the alleyway next to them. The villain slowly walked towards them. He walked through the flames and found himself on Shoto's side. Well, only two of ya. Toga must have found herself in a bit of a situation. Dabi grinned, staring into Shoto's eyes. She was really generous in who she picked. Toga? Izuku mumbled, looking at Shoto's conflicted expression. Yeah, crazy blonde girl with the obsession with blood. She was on a mission to retrieve you. He narrowed his eyes at them. You wouldn't happen to know where she went? We never saw Toga. She had nothing to do with this. Shoto spoke through clenched teeth. Seeing Dabi again was also very conflicting. He wasn't sure what to say. From what he remembered, Dabi didn't join the League until after Stain was apprehended. Something wasn't right about the situation, and Shoto wasn't prepared for what the answer would be. Then how'd you get here? Dabi chuckled. He towered over Shoto, standing just before his feet. Unless, of course, you decided to let a certain someone in on the big secret? This was when it all clicked in Shoto's mind. He bit the inside of his cheek and glared into Dabi's eyes. He doesn't know, and none of us plan on letting him know. We got here because of a slip of paper with the address on it. It was in Midoriya's apartment. Now, I'm no expert, but I do believe that must mean that my comrades have taken care of her. I wouldn't be so cocky. Toga is very capable. Dabi turned around. As for him, it's quite obvious that he knows. Shoto was silent for a moment, but when Izuku didn't seem confused or even say anything, he realized that Dabi wasn't lying. How? He asked Izuku, who stared right at him through the veil of flames. For a moment, Shoto wished that someone would randomly walk by and see the situation, maybe call for help, but he doubted it. Dabi had them in the blind spot of the bar, where they wouldn't be seen as easily. Izuku didn't say anything, which caused Dabi to turn towards him and grin. The flames vanished and Dabi grabbed a hold of the shoulders of each boy, leading them inside the bar. Shoto attempted to struggle, moving his shoulders against the path that Dabi was trying to move them in, refusing to move his legs, but his legs only ended up being dragged inside anyways. He gave up after only a minute, squinting as his eyes adjusted to the darkness of the building. He was thrown against the wall, and from what he could hear, Izuku was as well. He looked over and frowned as his eyes slowly adjusted, the figure of his friend appearing. "Are you all right?" "Yeah, fine," Izuku mumbled, sitting up against the wall. "You both are lucky. The rest of the league went out for a little field trip, so you only have to deal with me." Dabi stared at both of them. "Don't do anything stupid, I will kill you both." "You wouldn't kill him," Shoto muttered, refusing to look at the guy. "He's too important." "That's where you're wrong." "Huh." He felt his heart skip a beat. Was she bluffing? Did they really not need Izuku? No, that wouldn't be possible. "This isn't my first time trying to ensure a victory for the league. You heroes seem to like to try and fix your mistakes over and over and over, but it seems you all forget at a certain point, like you suddenly adjust your minds to the new timeline and forget about the old one." Shoto rolled his eyes, though he didn't like what was being implied. "What are you saying? I've seen so many scenarios of you all trying to win. If you fail to steer Deku away from villainy, he will destroy the world, just as you saw. If you save him and he becomes a hero, he wins the battle and saves Japan. But there has been one occurrence of him dying, a timeline where he jumped off the roof and died. Spoiler alert, the villains won. And each time, none of you could remember having went back in time at all." Shoto gaped, he stared at the floor and tried to process what he'd heard. The villains had no reason to keep Izuku alive, because if the heroes completed their task then they would lose. And they'd eventually forget? Did this mean they had a time limit? Maybe it occurred when the future was set in stone, or maybe a certain point in time. "So why haven't you killed me?" He looked at Izuku immediately. The fact that Izuku already knew the truth was something he'd have to ask him later. For now, he had to wonder why Izuku was so calm. Being told stuff like that, it should have made him a bit worried. After all, hearing his importance from the perspective of the villains couldn't be easy. Being told you could die and they could still win? No, that was too. What's the fun in that? Dabi glared at him. "You make a great villain, so wouldn't it make sense for me to try and spare your life?" "Not really." Izuku sat up. "If I were you, I'd want to ensure my victory instead of trying to play the game of cat and mouse. I'd just get rid of the problem." Dabi hummed. He paced around the room, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Get rid of the problem, huh? Of course you'd say that. Maybe that's why you succeeded so much. You didn't like to play little, you just crushed the prey with no remorse." Shoto and Dabi's eyes met. They both stared. Shoto didn't blink. He ignored the dull stinging and the way his eyes began to water, because if he broke eye contact then he had to admit that this wouldn't be an easy fight. "Well, I suppose you could say that I'm playing a bit of an experiment then. I'm changing the stakes, making things a bit more interesting." Dabi turned around. "I'll let both of you live for now, but next time you won't be so lucky." They were able to return to Izuku's apartment afterwards, though both seemed a bit dazed. Shoto couldn't even comprehend it all. The time travel stuff was already confusing to begin with, but now this? It was too much. "All right, how long have you known?" "Huh." Izuku looked up from the kitchen table and shrugged. "The other day I was coming home from school and I overheard you all talk about it. I didn't want you all to know that I knew, so I've been pretending." Shoto pursed his lips, letting out a long and well-overdue sigh. Neither of them knew where the others actually went, but it did seem like they had an encounter with Toga. He hoped no one got hurt and everything went well, but he figured they could handle themselves. "I hope they don't come back." "What?" Shoto looked up, staring at the boy beside him. "What are you dash?" "My life decides what happens to Japan. If I die or become a villain, then total destruction may occur. If I try to be a hero, I win some sort of battle and defeat the villains. I don't have a quirk is the thing. How the hell am I supposed to do any of that?" He frowned. "And the others?" They've been breathing down my neck and trying to figure out every detail of my life. I'm so tired of it, it's like I can't even blink without them trying to decipher what it meant. Shoto realized a long while ago that the whole thing wasn't going to work, and his mind once considered the idea that their intervention could make things worse. He didn't ever think the possibility was high, but now he can see how pained Izuku looks and he knows that he and the others messed up. I'm sorry, we should have realized the error and faults in our plan. We come from a timeline where we have lost everything except each other, and we just want to fix things. When we got here, we couldn't see you as this version of you. You're so different and kind. You let an entire group of strangers into your home just because you felt like you had to. He looked Izuku in the eyes, then held out his hand. My name is Shoto Todoroki, but I prefer to be called by my first name. I want to be a hero one day and save Japan. Izuku looked down at Shoto's hand and stared for a moment, then took it and accepted the handshake. My name is Izuku Midoriya. You can call me whatever name you'd like as long as it isn't Deku. There was a short pause. He held in his breath as he sat deep in thought. I don't want to be a hero nor a villain, but I know I want to help people and save them however I can. Shoto nodded and smiled. It's nice to meet you. Katsuki sighed, locking the door to his basement. The others were all getting settled into the guest room, which luckily could hold all of them. He had sleeping bags in the closet so they all could choose a spot on the floor. Toga was tied to a chair in the basement. She hadn't made any noise, so he felt no need to duct tape her mouth closed. Don't you think we should have at least waited until they got back? What'll Shoto do? Yururika asked, slowly approaching him. He can handle himself fine. If anything, he can keep an eye on Izuku without seeming like he's breathing down the kid's neck. Yurarika nodded. Katsuki had a bad feeling about something. The storm clouds rolling in through the sky didn't help. He sighed, walking into the guest room and watching his friends settle in. He'd have to worry about everything later. For now he had to make a plan.